Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. Imagine a young man standing at the edge of the world, looking out at an endless desert, dreaming of a city that does not yet exist. He is 24 years old, and he has already conquered most of the known world. His name is Alexander, and in his mind, he sees something impossible. A city where all the knowledge of humanity will gather, a place where Greek will speak with Egyptian, where Persian will debate with Indian, where the wisdom of every nation will flow together like rivers meeting the sea. He sees libraries and lecture halls, gardens where philosophers will walk, harbours where ships will arrive, carrying not just grain and wine, but ideas. Ideas that will be copied, studied, preserved forever. The year is 331 BC. Alexander stands on the western edge of the Nile Delta, between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mareotis. There is almost nothing here. A fishing village, some salt marshes, wind and water, and sun. By all logic, he should build his city somewhere else. Somewhere with fresh water, rich soil, established trade routes. But Alexander does not think like other men. He sees what does not exist and wills it into being. This city, he decides, will be called Alexandria. It will bear his name for all time. And here is the impossible thing, the paradox that should make us pause in wonder. Alexander will be dead within 8 years. He will never see his city completed. He will die in Babylon, far from Egypt, before the first library scroll is ever shelved. Yet his dream will outlive him by centuries. The Library of Alexandria will become the greatest repository of human knowledge the ancient world has ever known. For 600 years, perhaps more, it will stand as the intellectual heart of civilization. Scholars will travel from the edges of the earth to study there. Works of genius will be written within its walls. The foundations of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, literature, and philosophy, as we know them, will be laid in its halls. And then, somehow, it will vanish. Not in a single dramatic moment, though stories will claim that. The truth is stranger and sadder. The greatest library in the ancient world will fade away so gradually, so completely, that we cannot even say with certainty where it stood, or when it truly ended. We know it existed. We know some of what it contained. We know the names of brilliant minds who worked there. But the building itself, its exact location, the moment of its final destruction, all of these have been lost to time, swallowed by the same desert winds that blew across Alexander's vision. Tonight, we will trace the story of this impossible place. We will walk its halls in our imagination, meet the scholars who dedicated their lives to preserving knowledge, and confront the mystery of how something so magnificent could disappear almost without a trace. We will explore not just what was lost, but what it meant, why it mattered, and why, more than 2,000 years later, the Library of Alexandria still haunts our collective memory as the symbol of all the knowledge humanity has forgotten. But before we begin, may I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from and your local time. As the present fades to whispers, we find ourselves transported to the sun-baked streets of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC, where the scent of papyrus mingles with salt air, and the voices of scholars from a dozen lands echo through marble halls. The body thief's gambit. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BC, the world he had conquered tore itself apart. His generals, the men who had fought beside him from Macedonia to India, turned on each other like wolves. Each wanted his piece of the empire. Each claimed to be Alexander's true heir. And among these ambitious, ruthless men, one stood out for the audacity of his plan. His name was Ptolemy, and he had been one of Alexander's closest companions since childhood. While the other generals fought over who would control the vast empire as a whole, Ptolemy looked at the situation differently. He did not want everything. He wanted Egypt, Rich, ancient, defensible Egypt, with its endless grain harvests and its connection to African and Asian trade routes. Egypt, which had been old when Greece was young. Egypt, which knew how to survive. But Ptolemy understood something the other generals did not. To rule Egypt successfully, he needed more than military might. He needed legitimacy. He needed the Egyptian people to see him not as a foreign conqueror, but as the rightful successor to the pharaohs. And he needed the Greek world to see him as the true keeper of Alexander's legacy. So Ptolemy did something extraordinary, something shocking, something that would determine the course of Mediterranean history for 3 centuries. He stole Alexander's body. The funeral procession was moving slowly from Babylon back to Macedonia, where Alexander was to be buried in the royal tombs of his ancestors. The coffin was a wonder in itself, made of beaten gold, the body preserved in honey, the whole thing carried in a magnificent carriage pulled by 64 mules. It took 2 years to prepare. When it finally set out, it was meant to be the funeral of the age, a moving monument to the greatest conqueror the world had known. Ptolemy intercepted it in Syria. He had his army with him. The officers guarding the procession were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Without a battle, without bloodshed, Ptolemy diverted the body. He brought it to Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt. Later, he would move it to Alexandria, the city Alexander himself had planned. The other generals were furious. Some called it sacrilege, some called it theft. Ptolemy called it destiny. He now possessed the physical remains of Alexander, and in the ancient world, this meant something profound. It meant he held Alexander's blessing. It meant his capital city held the spiritual presence of the conqueror. It meant that Alexandria, still being built, was now not just another Hellenistic city, but the resting place of a god. For yes, Alexander was worshipped as a god now. In Egypt, the priests had declared him son of Amun. In Greece, cities raised altars to him. Ptolemy understood that controlling Alexander's body gave him religious authority to match his military power. People would come from across the world to see the tomb, and when they came, they would see something else, something Ptolemy was already planning. They would see the greatest library the world had ever known. Ptolemy declared himself king in 305 BC. He took the title pharaoh, linking himself to the ancient dynasties. But he also remained Greek, holding on to the language and culture of Macedonia. He was building something new, a fusion of Greek and Egyptian civilization, with Alexandria as its crown, and at the heart of this new Alexandria would be an institution unlike anything that had come before, a place where all the books in the world would gather, where all the knowledge of humanity would be collected, organized, studied, not a treasure house for one king's pleasure, but a working center of scholarship, where the brightest minds would be supported by the state to pursue knowledge for its own sake. Ptolemy had stolen a body to give his city spiritual legitimacy. Now he would build a library to give it intellectual legitimacy. The two were connected in his mind. Alexander's body would draw pilgrims. The library would draw scholars. Together, they would make Alexandria eternal. It was an ambitious plan. Some would say an impossible plan. But Ptolemy had learned from Alexander that impossible things could be achieved if you wanted them badly enough and thought big enough. Alexander had dreamed of a city of knowledge. Ptolemy would build it, and he knew exactly the man to help him design it. A philosopher's blueprint. His name was Demetrius of Phalerum, and when he arrived in Alexandria around 300 BC, he was a man fleeing failure. Once, he had governed Athens, the intellectual capital of the Greek world. For 10 years, he had ruled the city on behalf of Macedonian overlords, trying to balance philosophy with politics, wisdom with power. He had been a student of Aristotle's school, a man who loved books and learning above all things. But Athens had thrown him out when the political winds shifted. Now, in his 50s, brilliant and bitter, he found himself in Egypt, a refugee seeking shelter. Ptolemy saw not a failure, but an opportunity. Here was a man who understood both governance and scholarship, a man who had walked in Aristotle's own Lyceum, who knew how that great philosopher had organized his school and his library, a man who could design an institution that would surpass anything Athens or any other city had ever created. Ptolemy asked Demetrius a simple question: if you could build the perfect library with unlimited resources, with the support of a king, with the chance to start fresh without any constraints, what would you create? Demetrius answered, with a vision that would shape Western intellectual tradition for 2,000 years. First, he said, it cannot be just a library. Books alone are not enough. You need scholars to read them, debate them, understand them. You need teachers and students, a living community of learning. So we will build a mouseion, a temple to the muses, the goddesses of arts and sciences. It will be a research institute, a place where scholars can dedicate their lives to study without worrying about money or politics. Second, the library must collect everything, not just Greek literature, though that must be complete, but also Egyptian wisdom, Babylonian astronomy, Persian poetry, Indian mathematics, Jewish scriptures, every language, every culture, every kind of knowledge. We will translate what needs translating. We will organize what seems chaotic. We will make the wisdom of the entire world accessible in Greek. Third, we need more than just collecting. We need scholarship. We need people who will compare different versions of texts, who will establish which copy is most accurate, who will write commentaries explaining difficult passages. We need librarians who are also scholars, who understand what they preserve. Fourth, the scholars must be supported. They will live in the palace complex. They will eat in a common dining hall. They will pay no taxes. The king will fund their research, buy their books, give them time to think. In return, they will teach royal children when asked. They will perform research the king requests, but mostly they will be free to pursue knowledge wherever it leads. Ptolemy listened and understood that Demetrius was describing something revolutionary. In the ancient world, knowledge was usually private. Philosophers had small schools. Rich men collected scrolls for their personal libraries. But Demetrius was proposing something public in spirit, if not in access, something that would outlive any individual scholar, a permanent institution devoted to learning itself. The king gave his blessing. He gave his money. More importantly, he gave his authority. Letters went out across the Mediterranean world. Ptolemy is building a great library in Alexandria. Ptolemy is seeking scholars. Ptolemy is buying books. Ptolemy is offering sanctuary to learning. The physical design grew from this vision. The mouseion would be part of the royal palace complex, protected and prestigious. There would be lecture halls and study rooms, a dining hall where scholars would gather and debate, gardens, and covered walkways where one could stroll while thinking. And at the centre, the library itself, rooms upon rooms of scrolls stored in wooden cabinets, organised by subject and author. But how do you organise all the knowledge in the world? Demetrius thought about this problem. In Athens, Aristotle had begun grouping books by subject. Demetrius would expand this system. Poetry in one area, history in another, science in a third. Within each category, scrolls would be arranged alphabetically by author. Each scroll would have a tag attached, identifying its contents. This seems simple to us now. We are used to organized libraries. But in 300 BC, this was innovative. Most book collections were barely organized at all. The Library of Alexandria would pioneer the systems we still use today. Call numbers, subject classification, author attribution. These things had to be invented by someone. They were invented here. Demetrius understood that the library's value would depend on two things equally important. First, the comprehensiveness of its collection. Second, the accuracy of its texts. A library full of corrupted, error-filled copies would be worse than useless. So, from the beginning, The library would employ scholars to establish correct texts, to compare different versions, to note variants and errors. And this was the birth of textual criticism, of philology as a science. Before Alexandria, no one had approached ancient texts this way, with such systematic rigor. After Alexandria, it became the foundation of all literary scholarship. The blueprint was drawn, the vision was clear. Now came the hard part, actually filling the library with books. And for that, Ptolemy and his successors would prove willing to use any method necessary, no matter how aggressive, no matter how expensive, no matter how audacious. The hunger for scrolls, the Ptolemies wanted every book in the world, and they were willing to do almost anything to get them. The official policy was simple. The library would purchase any book offered for sale. Agents travelled throughout the Mediterranean, buying manuscripts from dealers, from private collections, from anyone who had something to sell. The library paid top prices. Word spread quickly. If you had a rare scroll, Alexandria would pay for it. But buying was not enough. The hunger was too great, the ambition too vast. So the Ptolemies developed other methods. There was a law, strange and unprecedented. Every ship that entered Alexandria's harbour was searched, not for contraband goods but for books. If any scrolls were found, they were seized and brought to the library. There, scribes would copy them quickly. The copies would be returned to the ship's owner. The originals would remain in Alexandria, labelled "from the ships." Imagine being a merchant arriving in Alexandria with your personal library, perhaps books your family has owned for generations, and having them confiscated by royal officials. You would protest, of course. You would be told the books would be returned, and they would be, eventually. But what came back would be copies, however good. The originals, with all their age and authority, would now belong to the library. Some protested, some tried to hide their books. But Alexandria was rich and powerful, and if you wanted to trade in the most prosperous city in the eastern Mediterranean, you accepted their terms. Over decades, hundreds of books entered the library this way, not through purchase, not through gift, but through what was essentially legalized theft, justified by the higher cause of preserving knowledge. The story is told, perhaps true, perhaps exaggerated, but revealing nonetheless, of how Ptolemy III borrowed the official state copies of the great Athenian tragedies from Athens. These were the texts performed in the theatre of Dionysus, the authoritative versions of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Athens was reluctant to lend them. Such texts were treasures, irreplaceable. But Ptolemy offered an enormous deposit, 15 talents of silver, a fortune that would guarantee the book's safe return. Athens agreed. The scrolls were sent to Alexandria, and Ptolemy did exactly what you might expect. He kept the originals, he had beautiful copies made, and sent those back to Athens. He forfeited the 15 talents without hesitation. What was money compared to possessing the true texts of the greatest playwrights Greece had ever produced? Athens was furious. But what could they do? Ptolemy ruled Egypt. His ships controlled the sea routes. His grain fed half the Mediterranean. He could afford to shrug off diplomatic protests. He had what he wanted. The library had what it needed. But beyond theft and sharp dealing, there was also genuine scholarly exchange. The Ptolemies invited scholars to Alexandria and asked them to bring their books. Many came willingly, drawn by the promise of resources, of a community of fellow scholars, of time to study without the pressures of daily survival. When these scholars arrived, they brought their personal libraries with them. And often, when they died, their collections would be absorbed into the great library, purchased from their estates, or donated by their students. The library grew at an astonishing rate. Within a few decades of its founding, it may have held 40,000 scrolls. Within a century, some ancient sources claim it held 400,000, or even 700,000 if you count the Serapeum, a daughter library in another part of the city. These numbers are difficult to verify, Ancient authors tended toward exaggeration, but even if we halve them, even if we quarter them, we are still talking about a collection unlike anything the ancient world had seen before. To put this in perspective, a wealthy private citizen in Athens might own 100 scrolls. A serious philosopher might have accumulated 500 over a lifetime. The Library of Alexandria aimed to collect everything that had ever been written in Greek, and then everything that could be translated into Greek. It was an impossible goal, but the pursuit of it drove the library's growth for generations. And the scholars came. They came from Athens and Corinth, from Antioch and Pergamum, from Tyre and Rhodes and Cyrene. They came because Alexandria offered what no other city could offer: access to all the books in the world, time to read them, colleagues to discuss them with, and royal support to pursue knowledge for its own sake. The library was becoming more than a collection of scrolls. It was becoming a living institution, a community of the mind, and some of the greatest intellects of antiquity were about to make it their home. 72 voices, speaking as one. Among the early triumphs of the library, one story stands out, not just for its scholarly achievement, but for what it revealed about the institution's ambitions. It involved a sacred text, a team of translators, and a miracle that may or may not have happened, but which people believed for centuries. The Jews of Alexandria needed their scriptures in Greek. This was a practical problem. The Jewish community in Alexandria was large and growing, but with each generation, fewer young people could read Hebrew fluently. They spoke Greek in the streets, conducted business in Greek, thought in Greek. Their spiritual lives were being cut off from their textual traditions. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, existed only in Hebrew. If Judaism was to thrive in the Greek-speaking world, a translation was essential. But this was not like translating Homer or Herodotus. This was the word of God. The stakes were immense. Translate badly, and you might corrupt divine truth. Translate loosely, and you might lose sacred meaning. Translate too literally, and the Greek might become incomprehensible. The translators would be walking a narrow path between faithfulness and readability, between the language of revelation and the language of commerce. The letter of Aristeas, written perhaps in the 2nd century BC, tells the story this way. Ptolemy II, called Philadelphus, the lover of his sister, wanted the Jewish law in his library. His librarian, perhaps Demetrius, suggested commissioning a translation. Ptolemy wrote to the high priest in Jerusalem. Would he send scholars who knew both Hebrew and Greek, who could render the sacred text into the language of learning? The high priest agreed. 72 scholars came to Alexandria, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Ptolemy housed them on the island of Pharos, site of the great lighthouse, in quiet chambers overlooking the sea. For 72 days, they worked. And when they finished, each translator read his work aloud. And miraculously, every version was identical, word for word. 72 men working separately had produced the exact same translation. This was proof, believers said, that God had guided their hands. The translation was not just accurate, but divinely inspired. Modern scholars doubt this miracle. They suggest the translators worked together, that the story of unanimous agreement was embellished to give the translation authority. But what matters is not whether the miracle happened, but that people needed to believe it happened. They needed to believe that translating sacred truth was possible, that meaning could survive the journey from one language to another, that Greek could carry Hebrew revelation without loss. The translation became known as the Septuagint, from the Latin word for 70, a rounding of 72. It would become one of the most influential books in history. Early Christians would use it, spreading Jewish scripture throughout the Greco-Roman world. St. Paul would quote from it. The early church fathers would read it. When Christianity separated from Judaism, the Septuagint would go with the Christians, becoming their Old Testament. But in the early 3rd century BC, all of that lay in the future. What mattered then was that the Library of Alexandria had undertaken something unprecedented. It had brought scholars together from different traditions, given them resources and time, and asked them to build a bridge between cultures, between languages, between ways of understanding the world. This would become the library's great project, repeated again and again with different texts. Egyptian priestly wisdom would be translated into Greek. Babylonian astronomical tables would be rendered accessible to Greek mathematicians. Persian histories would be made available to Greek readers. The library was becoming not just a repository, but a translation engine, making the knowledge of the entire known world available in a single language to a single scholarly community. And this community was growing in size and brilliance. The early Ptolemies understood that books alone were not enough. You needed minds to read them, interpret them, build upon them, so they recruited aggressively, offering stipends and housing, freedom and resources. They were building a faculty, a research institute, a university before universities existed. The dining hall of the Mausoleum became famous for its conversations. Scholars from different fields, from different nations, from different intellectual traditions, would meet over meals and argue. A geometer might debate with a poet, an astronomer might consult with a physician. Ideas would cross-pollinate. Questions raised in one discipline would find unexpected answers in another. This was the library's deeper magic. Not just the preservation of knowledge, but the creation of new knowledge through conversation, through the collision of different perspectives, through the freedom to think and argue and imagine. The scrolls were crucial, the raw material, but the scholars were the catalyst that turned information into understanding, facts into theories, data into wisdom. And among these scholars, a few would stand out, would produce works so brilliant that their names would echo through the centuries, their achievements would shape civilization. The golden age of Alexandrian scholarship was about to begin, and one man, armed with nothing but geometry and observation, was about to measure the entire earth. Walking among the scrolls, you approach the library in the early morning, when the sun is still low over the Mediterranean. The palace complex sprawls before you, white stone and soaring columns, gardens and fountains. Armed guards stand at the entrance, but they know you. You are a scholar, a member of the Mausoleum. They nod as you pass. Inside, the air is cooler. Marble floors echo with footsteps. You pass through a courtyard where citrus trees grow in massive pots, their scent mixing with sea air. You hear voices, Greek mostly, but also other languages you cannot quite identify. A group of scholars debates in a corner, their gestures animated. You continue on. The library itself occupies several connected buildings. You enter through the main hall, and the first thing that strikes you is the smell. Papyrus has a distinctive odour, earthy and dry. Thousands upon thousands of scrolls create an atmosphere unlike anywhere else in the world. It smells like knowledge itself, like time preserved. The light is carefully managed. Direct sunlight would damage the papyrus, fade the ink, so the windows are high and covered with linen screens, creating a soft, diffused glow. Oil lamps hang on chains, ready to be lit when evening comes. But for now, the natural light is enough. You can see dust motes floating in the air, tiny particles dancing in the filtered sunbeams. The scrolls are stored in wooden cubicles built into the walls, each scroll in its own compartment, with a tag hanging down, identifying its contents. The tags are made of small pieces of papyrus or parchment attached to the scroll with string. You walk along one wall, reading the tags. Euripides, Aristophanes, Menander. An entire wall of dramatic poetry. You trail your fingers along the wooden compartments as you walk, feeling the smoothness of the wood, aged and polished by countless hands before yours. In the centre of the room, tables are arranged for study. Some scholars are already here, though it is early. A young man bends over a scroll, his lips moving slightly as he reads. An older man, his beard streaked with grey, makes notes on a wax tablet, occasionally looking up to reference another scroll he has opened beside him. The sound in the library is not silence, but a quiet rustling, the whisper of papyrus unrolled, the scratch of stylus on wax, the occasional murmur as someone reads aloud to themselves. You find what you came for. A scroll of Herodotus, his histories. You have read it before, but there is a passage you need to check, a description of Egyptian customs. You lift the scroll from its compartment carefully. Papyrus is fragile, especially old papyrus. This scroll might be 50 years old, might be 100. No one knows for certain. The edges are worn, slightly darkened. The scroll has been read many times. You carry it to a table and sit down. Unrolling requires care. Too fast, and the papyrus might crack. Too much tension, and it might tear. You unroll with your right hand, roll up the finished portion with your left, creating a moving window onto the text. The columns of writing march across the scroll, each letter formed with care by some scribe you will never meet. The ink is black, but fading to brown in places. You see where corrections have been made, words scraped away and rewritten, notes added in the margins by previous readers. As you read, you become aware of the life around you. More scholars have entered. You hear the soft sound of sandals on stone. Someone drops a scroll, and there is a collective intake of breath, but no damage is done. A librarian moves through the room, checking that scrolls are being handled properly, that tags have not been displaced. He is one of perhaps a dozen librarians who maintain the collection, scholars themselves, but with a special dedication to preservation and organization. Through a doorway, you can see into another room where scribes work at copying. This is constant work, never finished. Scrolls deteriorate. They must be copied before they become unreadable. Some books are in high demand and need multiple copies. The scribes sit at high desks, their work illuminated by lamps, even in daylight, to ensure they make no errors. You hear the scratch of reed pens on papyrus, a sound like rain on leaves, continuous and soothing. The morning passes. You find your passage in Herodotus, make your notes. You return the scroll to its place, being careful to match the tag. As you leave, you pass the catalogues, the pinaches, the great lists that Callimachus has been compiling. These are scrolls that list scrolls, organized by subject and author, identifying where each work can be found. Without the catalogues, the library would be impossible to navigate. With them, any scholar can locate any text, can trace connections between works, can discover books they did not know existed. You step back out into the courtyard, blinking in the brighter light. The sun is higher now. The day is warming. You have work to do, calculations to make based on what you read. But you will be back tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The library is your world now. The scrolls are your companions, and somewhere, in all this accumulated wisdom, you believe, are answers to questions that have not yet even been properly asked. The gathering storm of minds. By the middle of the 3rd century BC, Alexandria had become what Ptolemy and Demetrius had envisioned, the intellectual capital of the world, and the scholars were coming, drawn by reputation, by resources, by the simple fact that nowhere else offered what Alexandria offered. They came from all corners of the Hellenistic world. From Athens, yes, still prestigious, but no longer the undisputed centre of learning. From the islands of the Aegean, from the cities of Asia Minor, from Sicily and southern Italy, where Greek colonies thrived. Some came young, seeking teachers and books. Others came established, bringing their own students and their own libraries. All were welcomed if they could demonstrate serious scholarship. The Mouseion was becoming like a modern university, though that word would not exist for more than 1,000 years. There were senior scholars, the equivalent of professors, who received stipends from the king and lived in quarters within the palace complex. There were younger scholars, some supported by their families, others working as assistants to the senior men. There were students, though the Mouseion was not exactly a school in the traditional sense. Learning happened through conversation, through reading, through assisting in research, through the casual transfer of knowledge that occurs when brilliant people share space and meals. The dining hall was the heart of this community. The Ptolemies fed their scholars well, understanding that intellectual work requires physical sustenance. 3 meals a day were provided, wine included, and the quality was good. This was not charity, but investment. A scholar worrying about where his next meal would come from could not focus on research. A scholar freed from such concerns could devote himself entirely to thought. But more than the food, the dining hall offered conversation. This was where connections were made, where collaborations began, where ideas jumped from mind to mind like sparks jumping gaps. An astronomer would describe his observations to a poet, who would ask questions an astronomer might never have considered. A physician would share his anatomical discoveries with a philosopher interested in the nature of the soul. A mathematician would explain a proof to a geographer who would see applications the mathematician had not imagined. This cross-pollination was Alexandria's secret advantage. Other cities had scholars. Other cities had libraries, though none as large. But Alexandria brought together specialists from every field and made them talk to each other. Knowledge, which elsewhere was fragmented across cities and schools and individual minds, here was concentrated, organized, made accessible. The library's catalogue system helped enormously. Callimachus, the poet and scholar, had begun the monumental task of listing every book in the library, organized by author and subject. His Pinakes, his tablets, would eventually fill 120 scrolls just to list the contents of the library. For the first time, a scholar could systematically search the collected knowledge of the past. Want to know what Aristotle wrote about ethics? The catalogue would tell you. Want to find all the works on Egyptian history? The catalogue would guide you. Want to compare different accounts of the Trojan War? The catalogue made it possible, and the library kept growing. Every ship that entered the harbour was still searched for books. Agents still travelled the Mediterranean buying manuscripts. Wealthy Alexandrians, eager to gain favour with the Ptolemies, donated their private collections, and scholars themselves kept producing new works, which were copied and added to the collection. The fields represented were becoming more diverse. Initially, the focus had been on Greek literature, poetry, drama, history, philosophy. But now, there were systematic works on every branch of knowledge. Mathematics and geometry were particularly strong, building on the foundations laid by Euclid, who had taught in Alexandria and whose elements had been written here. Astronomy was thriving, with access to centuries of Babylonian observations translated into Greek. Medicine was advancing through the controversial practice of human dissection, which was permitted in Alexandria, though forbidden elsewhere. Geography was becoming a science, rather than a collection of travellers' tales, and there were experiments in fields we would not recognise as separate disciplines. Grammar was being invented, the systematic study of language itself, literary criticism was emerging, the art of evaluating and comparing texts, bibliography, the organisation of knowledge about books, textual criticism, the establishment of accurate texts. All of these were new, created by Alexandrian scholars, trying to manage and make sense of the enormous collection surrounding them. Not everyone got along, of course. Scholars are human. There were rivalries, jealousies, feuds. Some thought others were getting too much support from the king. Some mocked the work of their colleagues. The poet Callimachus famously feuded with his student Apollonius over the proper length and style of epic poetry. Such quarrels could be bitter, conducted in verse and prose, each scholar recruiting allies, each trying to prove his approach superior. But even the quarrels were productive. They forced scholars to articulate their positions, to defend their methods, to think carefully about what they were doing and why. The arguments sharpened thinking, pushed people to be more rigorous, more careful, more creative. The Ptolemies mostly stayed out of scholarly disputes. They funded the institution, demanded periodic lectures or poetry for royal occasions, and otherwise left the scholars alone. This was wisdom. Scholarship cannot thrive under tight control. It needs freedom to pursue strange questions, to follow unlikely paths, to fail and try again. The Ptolemies understood this, or at least the early Ptolemies did. They created space for thinking and then protected that space. And in that protected space, extraordinary things were about to happen. Men were about to measure the Earth, propose that it orbited the Sun, dissect human bodies to understand how they worked, and catalogue the entire literary heritage of Greece. The golden age of Alexandrian science and scholarship was beginning, and its achievements would lay foundations that would last millennia, where rivers of knowledge meet the sea. But the library did not exist in isolation. It was part of Alexandria, and Alexandria was unlike any other city in the ancient world. Stand at the harbour, and you see the world coming to you. Ships from Athens and Corinth, from Rome and Carthage, from Phoenician cities on the Levantine coast. Ships from the Red Sea ports bringing goods from Arabia, from India, from East Africa. The harbour is always busy, always alive with shouting sailors, creaking rigging, the splash of oars. The smells are overwhelming. Tar and salt, spices and fish, the sweat of men loading and unloading cargo. And rising above it all, dominating the approach to Alexandria, stands the Pharaoh's lighthouse, one of the wonders of the world. 300 feet tall, or so they say, its fire visible for miles at sea. A beacon that tells every ship, here is Alexandria, here is safety, here is wealth, here is the future. The city spreads along the coast, organised by Alexander's architect on a grid pattern that makes it easy to navigate. Wide streets paved with stone, columns and porticos offering shade from the relentless sun, fountains fed by a canal from the Nile, gardens in courtyards, palm trees lining avenues. But more than the architecture, Alexandria is about mixture, about peoples who would never meet elsewhere, living side by side. There is the Greek population, ruling class, and scholars and merchants. There is the Egyptian population, older than memory, maintaining their temples and their ancient ways even as Greek becomes the language of power. There is the Jewish quarter, large and prosperous, its synagogues centres of learning as well as worship. There are Phoenicians and Syrians, Persians and Arabs, even a few Romans, though Rome is not yet the power it will become. Languages mix in the marketplace. Greek is the common tongue, the language of business and government. But walk through different quarters, and you hear Egyptian, Aramaic, Phoenician. The city is a translator's paradise and nightmare both, everyone communicating through some combination of native tongues and shared Greek. The mixture extends to knowledge. Egyptian priests still maintain their temple libraries, scrolls written in hieroglyphics and demotics, containing centuries of accumulated wisdom about medicine, astronomy, engineering. Some of this knowledge is making its way into Greek, translated by bilingual scholars, adding to the great library's collection. The Jews bring their own textual traditions, their elaborate interpretations of law and scripture. The Babylonian astronomical observations, carefully recorded over centuries, are being studied by Greek mathematicians who are developing new theories to explain the movements of the heavens. And at night, the city transforms. Oil lamps and torches light the main streets. Taverns fill with sailors and merchants. Music drifts from courtyards where the wealthy entertain. In the palace complex, the scholars gather in the dining hall, continuing their debates over wine. Somewhere, a poet recites new verses. Somewhere, an astronomer makes observations, noting the positions of stars. Somewhere, a physician studies a difficult text by lamplight, trying to understand the mysteries of the human body. The library is part of all this, both separate and connected. Separate, because it occupies the royal quarter, protected by walls and guards. Connected because its scholars walk the city streets, eat in taverns, shop in markets, encounter the full diversity of Alexandria's population. The knowledge preserved in the library comes from this diversity, and the library gives back to the city, training physicians and architects, advising on engineering projects, contributing to Alexandria's reputation as a centre of learning. Here, at this meeting point of Mediterranean and Africa, of Greek and Egyptian, of old and new, the greatest collection of human knowledge ever assembled is continuing to grow. The scrolls accumulate, the scholars multiply. The work goes on, day after day, year after year, and some of that work is about to produce results that will last forever. The first fruits of paradise. Within the first century of its existence, the Library of Alexandria could already point to achievements that justified its existence many times over. There was Euclid's Elements, 13 books of geometry that organized all known mathematical knowledge into a logical, systematic whole. Euclid had taught in Alexandria, had used the library's resources to gather and compare earlier mathematical writings. His Elements would become the most influential mathematics textbook in history. Studied for over 2,000 years, its axiomatic method, a model for all rigorous thinking, there was the beginning of systematic grammar. Scholars studying Homer noticed that different manuscripts had different readings, which was correct. This led to careful comparison of texts, to thinking about how language worked, to the development of rules for grammar and syntax. The Alexandrians were inventing philology, the scientific study of language and literature. There was the standardization of medical knowledge. Herophilus and Erasistratus, working in Alexandria, had performed systematic dissections of human bodies, permitted here, though forbidden in most Greek cities. They had discovered the nervous system, distinguished between sensory and motor nerves, understood that the brain, not the heart, was the center of thought. Their anatomical treatises, based on direct observation rather than speculation, represented a revolution in medical understanding. There was the calculation of the size of the Earth, which we will return to. There was the proposal of the heliocentric model of the solar system, radical and rejected, but showing how far Alexandrian thinking could push. There was the cataloguing of over 1,000 stars, the standardization of weights and measures, advances in engineering and mechanics. But beyond specific achievements, there was something more fundamental. Alexandria was establishing the methodology of scholarship itself. How do you determine which manuscript is most accurate? How do you organize knowledge? How do you build on previous work while correcting its errors? How do you balance respect for ancient wisdom with the need to revise theories when evidence demands it? These questions might seem obvious now. We take for granted that scholarship should be systematic, that texts should be carefully edited, that earlier work should be cited and compared. But someone had to establish these practices. Someone had to create the infrastructure of learning, and much of this happened in Alexandria in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. The Ptolemies could look at what they had built with satisfaction. The dream that Alexander had seen in the desert, that Ptolemy had claimed by stealing a body, that Demetrius had designed, was becoming real. Alexandria was not just another Hellenistic city. It was the place where human knowledge was preserved, organized, and advanced. But already, though few could see it yet, the seeds of decline were being planted. The library depended on royal support, on political stability, on the continued prosperity of Egypt, and all of these would prove fragile. The Ptolemaic dynasty would grow weak, torn by internal conflicts. Egypt would lose its independence, becoming first a Roman ally, then a Roman province. The values that supported pure scholarship would shift. Money would become scarcer. Priorities would change. None of this was apparent in the mid-3rd century BC. Then, the library seemed eternal, as permanent as the pyramids, as enduring as the Nile. Scholars worked on their projects, confident that their work would be preserved for future generations, that the institution protecting their research would last forever. They were right about the work. Much of what they discovered would indeed last, would be transmitted to later civilizations, would shape human thought for millennia. They were wrong about the institution. The library that preserved their work would itself not be preserved. The building would vanish, the collection would disperse, and later generations would search in vain for the exact location where the greatest library of the ancient world had stood. But that tragedy lay centuries in the future. For now, the library was alive, growing, productive. Scholars were arriving daily, books were being copied, new theories were being debated, and one man, the chief librarian, was about to perform a feat of measurement that would demonstrate the power of human reason in its purest form. He would calculate the circumference of the Earth using nothing but geometry, observation, and thought, and his answer would be accurate to within a few % of the true value. His name was Eratosthenes, and he was about to show the world what Alexandrian scholarship could achieve at its finest. The man who measured the Earth. Eratosthenes became chief librarian of Alexandria around 240 BC. He was a man of extraordinary range, a mathematician and geographer, a poet and philosopher, an athlete and music theorist. His contemporaries called him Beta, the second letter of the Greek alphabet, because he excelled in every field, but was not quite the absolute best in any single one. He took it as a compliment. Being second best in everything meant he could see connections that specialists missed, could bring insights from one discipline to illuminate problems in another. And one day, reading through the library's collection of travellers' reports and geographical observations, Eratosthenes noticed something curious. There was a town far south of Alexandria, down the Nile Valley, called Syene. Modern Aswan sits near where Syene stood, and in Syene, on the summer solstice, something remarkable happened. At exactly noon, the sun stood directly overhead, perfectly vertical. So perfectly vertical that a stick planted in the ground cast no shadow. So perfectly vertical that if you look down a deep well at that moment, you could see sunlight reflected from the water at the bottom, something impossible at any other time of year. Eratosthenes knew this did not happen in Alexandria. In Alexandria, even at noon on the summer solstice, the sun was never quite overhead. A vertical stick always cast a small shadow. The sun's rays struck the earth at a slight angle, not straight down. Most people would have found this mildly interesting and moved on. Eratosthenes saw in this simple observation a way to measure the entire earth. His reasoning went like this. If the earth is flat, the sun's rays, coming from so far away, should strike everywhere at the same angle. The sun should be the same height in the sky, whether you are in Syene or Alexandria or anywhere else. But if the earth is curved, if it is a sphere, as some philosophers had suggested, then the sun's rays, striking different parts of the sphere, would arrive at different angles. In Syene, at a particular moment, the rays might arrive perfectly perpendicular. In Alexandria, north of Syene, the same rays would arrive at a slant because they were hitting a curved surface. The difference in angle would tell you the curvature. And if you knew the curvature, you could calculate the circumference. It was geometry, pure and simple. The kind of geometry Euclid had systematized, the kind taught in Alexandria to every serious student of mathematics. Eratosthenes needed two pieces of information. First, the angle of the sun's shadow in Alexandria at the exact moment when the sun was directly overhead in Syene. Second, the distance between the two cities. The angle was easy. On the summer solstice, at noon, Eratosthenes measured the shadow cast by a vertical post in Alexandria. He measured the height of the post and the length of its shadow. Simple trigonometry gave him the angle, 7 degrees and 12 minutes, or roughly 1/50th of a circle. The sun in Alexandria was 1/50th of a circle away from being directly overhead. The distance was harder. Syene was about 5,000 stadia south of Alexandria. A stadium was a Greek unit of length, the distance of a standard running track, roughly 600 feet. 5,000 stadia meant about 500 miles. Eratosthenes probably got this number from royal surveyors. from camel caravan drivers who knew the route, from the records that Egypt's organized bureaucracy kept about distances between cities. Now came the beautiful part, the moment when observation and mathematics united to reveal a truth about the cosmos. If Alexandria and Syene are separated by 7 degrees of the Earth's circumference, and if they are 5,000 stadia apart, then the full circle of the Earth must be 50 times that distance. 50 times 5,000 is 250,000 stadia. That is the circumference of the Earth. Converting ancient stadia to modern units is imprecise because different Greek cities use slightly different lengths. But most reconstructions put Eratosthenes' answer at around 25,000 miles. The actual circumference of the Earth at the equator is about 24,900 miles. Eratosthenes, working in the 3rd century BC with a stick and a shadow and the power of geometric reasoning, had calculated the size of the planet to within 2% accuracy. Think about what this means. No one had flown around the Earth. No one had sailed around it, though some had dreamed of doing so. No one had any way to directly measure such a vast distance. And yet, sitting in the library in Alexandria, using information gathered from books and travellers and his own observations, Eratosthenes had determined the Earth's size. He had used his mind to measure something far too large to measure by hand. This was Alexandrian scholarship at its peak. The ability to gather information from diverse sources, to see patterns others missed, to apply mathematical reasoning to physical observations, to trust that the universe operated by rational principles that the human mind could understand. Eratosthenes showed that you did not need to travel the world to know the world. You needed careful observation, logical thinking, and access to the accumulated knowledge of previous generations. The library made this possible. Without the library's collection of geographical reports, Eratosthenes might never have learned about the phenomenon at Syene. Without the mathematical texts, particularly Euclid's work on geometry, he might not have known how to calculate the answer. Without the institution supporting him, giving him time to think, rather than forcing him to make a living teaching or serving in government, he might never have pursued the question. And Eratosthenes did not stop with measuring the Earth. He created a world map, one of the first to use a grid system of latitude and longitude. He calculated the tilt of the Earth's axis. He estimated the distance to the Sun and Moon, though these calculations were less accurate than his measurement of Earth's circumference. He wrote poetry and philosophy. He served as chief librarian for decades, overseeing the library's continued growth and organization. His work on the Earth's size was not universally accepted. Some scholars thought his methods were too clever, too abstract. They wanted direct measurement, not geometric inference. But his calculation survived, was transmitted to later generations, influenced how educated people thought about the planet they lived on. When Columbus planned his voyage west to reach Asia, he used a smaller estimate of the Earth's circumference and miscalculated how far he would need to sail. If he had trusted Eratosthenes, he would have known that Asia was much farther west than he hoped, that the voyage he planned was impossible with the ships and supplies he had. But that was nearly 2,000 years in the future. In the 3rd century BC, Eratosthenes had simply demonstrated what human reason could achieve when given access to knowledge, when freed to think, when supported by an institution dedicated to learning. He had shown that the library was not just preserving knowledge, but creating it. Not just collecting wisdom, but generating wisdom. And he was not alone in making such contributions. Other scholars, working in the same library, walking the same halls, eating in the same dining hall, were pushing the boundaries of human understanding in equally dramatic ways. Aristarchus looks at the Sunday. Around the same time that Eratosthenes was measuring the Earth, another scholar was proposing something even more radical, something so contrary to common sense and universal belief that it would be rejected for nearly 2,000 years. His name was Aristarchus of Samos, and he suggested that the Earth orbits the Sun. Every culture in the ancient world, as far as anyone knew, believed the Earth stood still at the center of the cosmos. This made perfect sense. The ground beneath your feet feels solid, unmoving. The sun rises in the east, crosses the sky, sets in the west. The moon and stars move across the heavens. Obviously, they move while the earth remains still. Anyone can see this. Any child knows this. But Aristarchus looked at the available evidence and reached a different conclusion. He proposed that the sun stood at the center, that the earth and other planets revolved around it, and that the earth also rotated on its axis once each day. The sun did not move across the sky. The earth turned, creating the illusion of solar movement. The stars did not revolve around the earth. The earth orbited the sun, changing our perspective on the stars as we moved. How did he arrive at this outrageous idea? We do not know for certain. His treatise on the heliocentric model has not survived, though later authors reference it, but we can make educated guesses based on his other work and on later astronomers who revived his ideas. Aristarchus had calculated the relative sizes and distances of the sun and moon. His methods were ingenious, using the geometry of eclipses and the phases of the moon to establish proportions. His calculations were not very accurate, limited by the precision of naked eye observation and by some faulty assumptions, but they led him to realize that the sun was much larger than the earth. Much, much larger. If the sun is enormous and the earth is comparatively tiny, which should be the center? Ancient cosmology assumed that the more important object sat at the center of the universe, but Aristarchus perhaps thought differently. If the sun is vastly more massive, perhaps it makes more sense for smaller bodies to orbit it, rather than for the massive sun to orbit the small earth. There was also the problem of retrograde motion. If you watch Mars or Jupiter carefully over months, you notice that most of the time they move eastward against the background of stars, but occasionally they slow, stop, move westward for a while, then resume their eastward motion. Ancient astronomers explained this with complex systems of circles moving on circles, epicycles, that created these backward loops. But if the Earth and planets all orbit the Sun at different speeds, retrograde motion is just a natural consequence of perspective, of the Earth overtaking a slower outer planet or being overtaken by a faster inner one. Aristarchus's model was elegant. It was simple. It explained observations without requiring complex mathematical machinery, but it was also, by the standards of the time, clearly wrong. The most obvious objection was the lack of stellar parallax. If the Earth orbits the Sun, then our position changes by enormous distances over the course of a year. The stars should appear to shift position, nearby stars moving more than distant ones, creating a parallax effect. Ancient astronomers looked for this effect and could not find it. Therefore, they concluded, the Earth must not be moving. Aristarchus had an answer. The stars are so incredibly distant that parallax exists, but is too small to measure with available instruments. This was true, but it required accepting that the universe was vastly larger than anyone had imagined. It meant the stars were not just beyond the moon and sun, but at distances almost impossible to comprehend. Most people found this harder to believe than the idea that the Earth stood still. There were other objections. If the Earth is spinning, why don't we feel it? Why aren't we flung off into space? Why don't objects flying through the air get left behind as the Earth rotates beneath them? These questions about motion and inertia would not be properly answered until Galileo and Newton, 1700 years later, and there was a philosophical objection, harder to articulate, but deeply felt. Human beings matter. The Earth is where humanity lives. It felt right that the Earth should be at the center of the cosmos, that the heavens should revolve around us. To place humanity on a planet spinning through empty space, one world among others orbiting an enormous sun, diminished our importance. It was psychologically unsettling, even threatening. So Aristarchus's heliocentric model was rejected. Most scholars ignored it. Some mocked it. One philosopher accused Aristarchus of impiety. of removing the Earth from its rightful place at the center of things. The idea survived only as a curious footnote, a wild speculation that most serious thinkers dismissed. The irony is bitter. Aristarchus was right. The Earth does orbit the Sun. His model, developed in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC, was essentially correct, and humanity would spend the next 1800 years believing a model that was essentially wrong, that required ever more complex mathematics to explain observations, that placed the Earth at the center of an elaborate cosmic machinery that did not actually exist. When Copernicus revived the heliocentric model in the 16th century AD, when Galileo defended it in the 17th century, when Newton explained the mathematics of orbital motion, they were rediscovering what Aristarchus had known. And by then, Aristarchus's original treatise was long lost. Copernicus mentions him briefly, acknowledging the ancient precedent, but he had to develop the model independently, had to fight the same battles Aristarchus had fought, had to answer the same objections. This is part of the tragedy of the library's eventual loss. Not just that books were destroyed, but that ideas were lost, that insights had to be rediscovered, that humanity had to relearn lessons it had once known. Aristarchus gave us the heliocentric model in the 3rd century BC. We rejected it. We lost his reasoning. We had to find our way back to the truth without his help. How much further along might we be if his work had survived, had been studied, had been built upon? But in his own time, Aristarchus could not know that his model would be vindicated, or that his treatise would be lost. He was simply a scholar at the library, pursuing truth wherever it led, proposing ideas that seemed logical to him, even if others disagreed. And the library supported him, gave him access to observations and mathematical tools, allowed him to think freely, even when his thoughts challenged conventional wisdom, the catalogue of everything. While Eratosthenes measured the Earth and Aristarchus rethought the cosmos, another scholar was tackling a problem closer to home but no less daunting. How do you organize all the knowledge in the world? Callimachus was a poet first, a scholar second, but the two roles were inseparable in his mind. Poetry required knowledge, required reading everything that had been written before, understanding traditions and innovations, knowing what every previous poet had attempted. And as he read through the library's vast collection, Callimachus realized that without organization, without some systematic way to find and compare works, the library's very size was becoming a problem. Imagine you want to read everything Aeschylus wrote. Where do you begin? The scrolls are organized by subject, so dramatic works are grouped together. But within that group, are they alphabetical by author, by title, by date of composition? Different sections of the library use different systems. Some scrolls have been misfiled, some tags have been lost or damaged. You could spend weeks just locating all of Aeschylus's plays. Or imagine you want to study the development of Greek historiography. You need to find works by Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, and dozens of lesser-known historians. You need to know which works survive, which exist in multiple copies, which are fragments or epitomes. You need to know who wrote what when, which historians influenced which others. Without a comprehensive catalogue, this research is nearly impossible. Callimachus understood that the library needed a catalogue that was itself a work of scholarship, not just a list, but an analytical tool. So he undertook the Pnyx, the tablets, a comprehensive catalogue of all Greek literature as preserved in the Library of Alexandria. The work consumed decades. Callimachus and his assistants examined every scroll in the library, noted its author, title, and subject, added biographical information about authors, included opening lines so works could be identified, noted the number of lines in each work, and organized everything by subject, and then alphabetically within each subject. The Pnyx eventually filled 120 scrolls. Think about that. 120 scrolls just to catalogue the library. This was not a simple list. Each entry included context, background, sometimes critical commentary. Callimachus was creating a reference work that was itself literature. He divided literature into categories: epic poetry, lyric poetry, tragedy, comedy, history, oratory, philosophy, miscellaneous prose. Within each category, he listed authors alphabetically. For each author, he provided a brief biography, noting where they were born, who their teachers were, what they were famous for. Then he listed their works, again alphabetically, with opening lines and lengths. This categorization system was not neutral. It reflected value judgments about what kinds of writing mattered, how they should be grouped, which authors deserved the most attention. Callimachus was not just organizing knowledge, but defining what counted as knowledge, establishing a canon of literature that would influence education and scholarship for centuries. He was also inventing literary biography. Before the Pnyx, there was no systematic collection of information about authors' lives. Scattered anecdotes existed, legends, and gossip. Callimachus tried to separate fact from fiction, to establish basic biographical facts, to create scholarly rather than mythological portraits of writers. He was not always successful. Ancient biography had different standards than modern scholarship. Moral lessons often trumped factual accuracy, but he established the principle that knowing about an author's life could illuminate their work, that biography and bibliography belong together. The Pnyx also addressed authenticity. Many works were falsely attributed to famous authors. A scroll might claim to be by Aristotle, but actually be by one of his students, or by a much later imitator. Callimachus, comparing writing styles and checking historical references, tried to identify forgeries. His judgments were not infallible, but he established textual criticism as a discipline, the careful examination of evidence to determine authenticity, and perhaps most importantly, the Pnyx made it possible to see what had been lost. If Callimachus listed 20 plays by Aeschylus, but only 7 survived, later scholars would know that 13 had disappeared. This awareness of loss, this knowledge of gaps in the record, would haunt future generations. The Pnyx became a kind of monument to vanished literature, a ghost catalogue of works that once existed but would never be read again. Callimachus himself knew that his catalogue would need constant updating. New works arrived at the library daily. Errors would be discovered. Attribution judgments would be challenged. The Pnyx was not a final authority but a working tool, meant to be revised and corrected by future librarians. But the Pnyx did not survive. Like so much from the library, it was lost. We know about it from references in later authors, from fragments and summaries, but we do not have the complete work. The comprehensive catalogue of ancient literature, the first systematic bibliography in Western tradition, exists now only as scattered quotations and descriptions. There is a painful irony here. The catalogue meant to preserve knowledge of books was itself not preserved. The tool designed to ensure nothing would be forgotten was forgotten. And so we have lost not just the books themselves, but also the best record of what books existed, who wrote them, and what they contained. Yet Callimachus's influence survived his catalogue. The principles he established, the categories he created, the idea that a library needs systematic organization, all of these became standard practice. Every modern library catalogue, every bibliography, every systematic organization of knowledge owes something to Callimachus and the Pnyx. He created the infrastructure of scholarship, the invisible systems that make research possible, and he did it while writing poetry, while producing literary criticism, while teaching students, while engaging in famous feuds with rivals. He was beta, second best at everything, but his second best was good enough to change how humanity organizes knowledge. Geometry's perfect architecture. There is a story told about Euclid, perhaps true, perhaps invented to make a point, but revealing either way about what the library represented. A young man comes to Alexandria to study. He is wealthy, well-connected, used to getting what he wants. Perhaps he is related to the royal family. Perhaps his father is a high official in the Ptolemaic government. He has heard that geometry is fashionable among educated people, that knowing mathematics is a mark of sophistication. So he presents himself to Euclid, who teaches geometry in the palace complex. Euclid accepts him as a student. The young man settles into his seat, ready to be taught. Euclid begins with the definitions. A point is that which has no part. A line is breadthless length. A surface is that which has length and breadth only. The young man listens, nods, finds it all rather abstract and boring. Then Euclid moves to the axioms, the self-evident truths, upon which all geometry rests. Things equal to the same thing are equal to each other. If equals are added to equals, the wholes are equal. The whole is greater than the part. The young man shifts in his seat. When do they get to the interesting part? When does he learn the practical applications, the tricks for measuring land or calculating volumes? Euclid begins the first proposition. How to construct an equilateral triangle given one side. He draws a line segment. He describes arcs from each endpoint, with radius equal to the segment. Where the arcs intersect, he marks a point. He draws lines from this point to each endpoint. He proves the resulting triangle is equilateral. The young man interrupts. Teacher, this is all very tedious. Can we not skip to the important theorems? Perhaps there is a royal road to geometry, a quicker path for those who do not need every detail. Euclid looks at him, and the look is not unkind but absolutely firm. There is no royal road to geometry, he says. King and commoner must both travel the same path, must both master each step. You cannot understand the 100th theorem without proving the 99th. You cannot skip the foundations and expect the structure to stand. The young man protests. He is accustomed to special treatment, to shortcuts and privileges. Surely for someone of his standing, for someone who needs only a gentlemanly acquaintance with the subject rather than deep expertise, some accommodation can be made. Euclid is immovable. Geometry is not like politics or commerce where influence and connections matter. In geometry, there are only correct proofs and incorrect proofs. Either you understand the logic, or you do not. Either you accept the axioms and follow the reasoning, or you remain ignorant. There are no shortcuts, no easier paths, no royal roads. The young man can accept this or leave. What he cannot do is demand special treatment. In the realm of pure reason, all men are equal. Truth does not care about your wealth or your family name or your political connections. This story, whether it happened exactly this way or not, captures something essential about Alexandrian scholarship at its best. The library and the Mausion created a space where ideas mattered more than status, where arguments were won by logic rather than by position, where a poor scholar with a good proof could defeat a wealthy student with a bad one. Euclid's Elements embodied this democratic ideal of reason. The work was available to anyone who could read Greek. It required no special equipment, no expensive materials, just the ability to think, to follow an argument, to understand that each statement must be justified by earlier statements or by self-evident axioms. The Elements organized all known geometry into 13 books, each building on the previous ones, each theorem proved from earlier theorems, the whole structure resting on just 5 postulates that Euclid declared self-evident. It was an edifice of pure logic, as perfect in its way as any temple built of stone. And it was more than geometry. The method Euclid employed, the axiomatic method of starting with clear definitions and simple assumptions and building up complex conclusions through rigorous proof, would become the model for all systematic thinking. Centuries later, philosophers would try to construct ethics in the geometric manner. Scientists would present their discoveries in the form of axioms, propositions, and proofs. The Elements shaped not just mathematics, but the entire Western intellectual tradition. Euclid had written it in Alexandria, using the library's resources to compile and organize the work of earlier mathematicians. Thales, Pythagoras, Eudoxus, Theaetetus, all the great geometers of the past had contributed pieces. Euclid brought them together, added his own contributions, and created a systematic whole that surpassed anything that had come before. The young man in the story, if he had the patience to continue his studies, would have discovered something wonderful. He would have found that geometry, far from being tedious, opened up a world of pure form and logical necessity. He would have learned to see relationships invisible to untrained eyes, to construct proofs that revealed truths about space and number. He would have discovered that the human mind, reasoning carefully from simple assumptions, could achieve certainty, could know things with absolute conviction rather than mere probability. And if he persevered to the end of the elements, if he worked through all 13 books, he would have reached the final theorems about solid geometry and the construction of the 5 regular polyhedrons. He would have seen how everything connected, how the simple truths stated at the beginning supported increasingly complex structures, how the whole edifice held together with perfect internal consistency. This was what the library offered. Not just access to books, but access to the highest achievements of human reason. Not just information, but transformation. The possibility of seeing the world differently, of thinking more clearly, of participating in the great conversation that had been going on since the first humans began to wonder why things are as they are. There was no royal road to such understanding, but there was a road, and it was open to anyone willing to make the journey. Dawn in the Mauseon, you wake before sunrise. The room you occupy is small but comfortable, part of the scholars' quarters within the palace complex. The bed is better than you grew up with, the blankets Egyptian cotton. Through the window, you can see the sky beginning to lighten over the Mediterranean, stars fading as grey spreads across the east. You rise, wash your face in the basin that stands in the corner. The water is cool, bracing. You dress in your everyday clothes, nothing fancy. Scholars are not expected to dress richly. Some of the older men affect a philosophical poverty, wearing deliberately shabby robes as a statement. You are somewhere in between, clean but not ostentatious. The corridors are quiet at this hour. Your sandals make soft sounds on stone floors. You pass closed doors behind which other scholars still sleep. Some work late into the night and rise late in the morning. Others, like you, prefer to work in the early hours when the mind is fresh and the library is not yet crowded. You emerge into one of the gardens. The air is cool and damp, that particular quality of air just before sunrise in a Mediterranean summer. Citrus trees stand in rows, their leaves dark against the pale sky. You hear birds beginning to sing, tentative at first, then with growing confidence as the light increases. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crows. The dining hall is already open. Bread and fruit are laid out, cheese, olives, watered wine or water from clay jars. A few early risers are eating, nodding to you as you enter. You recognize most of them by sight, know some by name. The astronomer who spends his nights on the roof of the Museon charting star positions. The physician who assists with dissections. A poet whose name you cannot quite remember, but who always looks slightly hungover in the morning. You take bread, cheese, an apple. The bread is fresh, baked somewhere in the palace kitchens before dawn. You eat standing, drinking water from a cup, looking out through the colonnade at the growing light. The day feels full of possibility. You have questions you want to pursue, texts you want to consult, ideas that came to you as you were falling asleep last night. As the sun breaks over the horizon, flooding the garden with golden light, more scholars begin to arrive. The dining hall grows noisier, conversations starting, debates from yesterday resuming. You listen to 2 men arguing about poetic meter, their Greek rapid and technical. Another group discusses astronomical observations, comparing notes, trying to resolve a discrepancy in their data. You finish eating and make your way toward the library. The day is warming quickly. By noon, it will be hot. but morning in Alexandria is pleasant, the sea breeze keeping temperatures moderate. You pass through courtyards and under covered walkways. The palace complex is vast, a small city within the city. Guards stand at intervals, but pay scholars no attention. You are recognized, approved, part of this privileged community. The main library building stands before you, its facade catching the morning sun. You climb the steps and enter. The smell hits you immediately. That distinctive scent of papyrus and dust, of old ink and wooden shelving. The morning light streams through high windows, filtered through linen screens. The library is already alive with activity. Librarians are checking the shelves, ensuring scrolls are properly stored. Scribes in the copying room are preparing for the day's work, setting up their writing desks, mixing ink, cutting fresh reeds for pens. You make your way to the section you need. Mathematics today. You are working on a problem in astronomy that requires geometric calculations. You need to consult Euclid, of course, but also some of the more specialized works on spherical geometry. You locate the scrolls you need, check their tags to ensure they are the right texts, and carry them carefully to a reading desk. Unrolling the first scroll, you begin to read. The Greek is dense, technical. Each proposition must be considered carefully. Each proof followed step by step. You make notes on your wax tablet, drawing diagrams, testing examples. The work is slow but absorbing. Time seems to disappear. When you look up, the sun has moved considerably. The angle of light through the windows has changed. Around you, the library hums with quiet activity. Other scholars bent over their own texts, muttering to themselves as they read. A young student asks a librarian for help locating a specific work. Two older men compare copies of the same text, noting differences between manuscripts, debating which reading is more likely original. This is your life now. Not the only life available to an educated Greek, but the one you have chosen. No glory in battle, no wealth from commerce, no power from politics. Instead, this, the slow, patient work of understanding, of adding tiny increments to the sum of human knowledge, of preserving and interpreting the wisdom of the past. You are aware of your privileges. Most people in Alexandria are not scholars. They are merchants and sailors, craftsmen and labourers, slaves and servants. They work to eat, to feed their families, to survive. You work to understand. The Ptolemies support this work, believing it brings prestige to their kingdom, but also, you hope, believing that knowledge itself has value, that a civilization should be measured not just by its wealth and military power, but by its learning and culture. At midday, you return to the dining hall. The main meal is being served, bread and fish, lentils with onions, more wine. You sit with other scholars, and the conversation ranges widely. Someone mentions a new manuscript that arrived from Athens yesterday. Someone else describes an unusual medical case, he observed. The astronomer complains that clouds have prevented observations for 3 nights running. You contribute when you have something to say, listen when you do not. This casual exchange of information, this cross-pollination of ideas, is as valuable as the time spent reading. A comment from the physician suggests a new approach to your astronomical problem. A question from the poet makes you realize you have been assuming something that needs to be proven. After the meal, some scholars return to work. Others stroll in the gardens, discussing their projects, forming collaborations. You spend the afternoon copying passages from the scrolls you consulted, wanting to have your own notes to refer to later. The work is tedious, but necessary. Unless you copy or memorize, the knowledge stays in the library when you leave. Evening comes. The library begins to empty as scholars head to dinner. You have been reading and thinking for most of the day. Your eyes are tired, your hand cramped from writing, but you have made progress. You have found the mathematical tools you needed. Tomorrow, you can apply them to your astronomical problem. You return the scrolls to their proper places, checking that the tags are correct. A librarian nods approval. Proper care of the collection is everyone's responsibility. These scrolls may be used by scholars decades from now. They must be preserved. As you walk back to your quarters in the fading light, you think about the strangeness of your life. In a world where most people labor physically, where wealth and power determine status, you spend your days reading texts written by men long dead, solving problems that have no immediate practical application. And yet you feel that this work matters. The understanding you are building, the knowledge you are preserving and extending will outlive you. It will be here in the library, available to scholars not yet born, contributing to a conversation that spans generations. You fall asleep thinking about geometry and the movement of planets, about the questions you want to pursue tomorrow, about the life you have been fortunate enough to lead. Outside your window, the Mediterranean laps against Alexandria's harbour, a sound that has accompanied countless scholarly nights, a sound that will continue long after you and your work are forgotten. The art of the copyist. Nestor has been a scribe for 12 years, and his hands show it. His right thumb has a permanent callus where it presses against the reed pen. His fingertips are stained brown from handling ink. His back aches from hours bent over his work desk. He is 32 years old and will probably be doing this work until his eyes fail or his hands cramp too badly to hold a pen steady. But he takes pride in his craft. Not every scribe does. Some see it as just a job, words to be transferred from one surface to another, no different from loading cargo onto ships. Nestor knows better. He is preserving knowledge. The scrolls he copies will outlive him, will carry the words of Homer or Herodotus or Euclid forward into the future. When he makes a clean copy, free of errors, he is performing a sacred duty. This morning, he is copying a text of Sophocles, the tragedy, Antigone. It is a popular text, frequently consulted by scholars and students, and the library's copies are wearing out. One scroll in particular has been used so many times that the papyrus is brittle, the ink fading. Before it becomes unreadable, it must be copied. Nestor sits at his high desk in the copying room. The room is well lit, lamps suspended from the ceiling, even though it is daylight. Good light is essential. A scribe who misreads a letter because of dim light can introduce an error that will persist through every subsequent copy. He has prepared his materials with care. The papyrus is new, purchased from the best supplier in Alexandria. It is Egyptian papyrus, made from reeds grown in the Nile Delta, cut into strips, laid crosswise, pounded flat. The quality is excellent, the surface smooth and receptive to ink. Inferior papyrus can be rough, causing the pen to catch, or so porous that ink spreads and letters blur. His ink is a mixture of soot and gum arabic, ground together and mixed with water to the right consistency. Too thick and it clogs the pen, too thin and it runs. Nestor has been mixing his own ink for years and can judge the consistency by feel. Some scribes buy ink ready-made, but Nestor prefers to control every aspect of his work. His pens are cut from reeds, each one carefully prepared. The reed is split at the tip to create flexibility, then trimmed to create a flat nib. Different widths of nib produce different thicknesses of line. For this text, Nestor uses a medium nib, appropriate for literary work. Official documents require a finer hand. Casual letters can be written with cruder tools. He has the original scroll propped before him. He will copy one column at a time, reading a phrase, holding it in memory, then writing it onto the new papyrus. Some scribes copy letter by letter, which is slower but reduces errors. Nestor has enough experience to work in phrases, which is faster and produces a more natural flow to the writing. He begins. In Greek, the opening line, "O common self-same sister of my Ismene." The words are famous, known to every educated person. But Nestor writes them as carefully as if they were completely new. Each letter must be clear, properly formed. There are conventions, Certain letters join, others do not. Certain abbreviations are standard, others are not permitted in formal texts. The work requires total concentration, a moment of distraction, and he might skip a word, might write the same word twice, might substitute a similar-looking letter. Alpha and lambda can be confused. Theta and omicron. A scribe must be constantly vigilant. As he copies, Nestor notices something in the original text. There is a correction, a word that has been scraped away and written over. This means someone, probably another scribe or possibly a scholar, found an error in an earlier copy. Nestor pauses. Should he copy the correction or try to determine what the original word was? This is the eternal problem of textual transmission. Errors accumulate. A scribe makes a mistake. His copy is copied, perpetuating the error. Someone catches it, corrects it, but now there are two versions in circulation. Which is correct? Often you cannot tell without comparing multiple manuscripts, without checking context, without understanding Greek grammar and poetic meter well enough to judge what makes sense. Nestor makes a note in the margin of his copy, using red ink to distinguish his comment from the black text. Original unclear, he writes. Correction copied. A scholar, examining this manuscript in the future, will know there is a textual problem here, will know to check other copies if the reading matters. The morning passes. Nestor's hand moves steadily, dipping the pen in ink, writing, dipping again. The rhythm is almost meditative. His mind is engaged but not strained. He is simply a channel through which the words flow from one scroll to another, from past to future. Other scribes work nearby. The room is quiet except for the scratch of pens on papyrus. Occasionally someone mutters, working through a difficult passage, trying to decipher unclear writing. One scribe gets up to fetch a different copy of the text he is working on, wanting to compare readings. At midday, they break for the meal. Nestor's hands are cramped. He flexes his fingers, trying to relieve the stiffness. His eyes feel gritty from the sustained focus, but he is satisfied with the morning's work. He has completed 3 columns, perhaps a third of the full play. At this rate, he will finish the copy in 3 days. After eating, he returns to his desk. The afternoon light is slightly different, requiring adjustment of the lamps. He continues where he left off. The play's plot unfolds in the words, he copies, though he is not really reading for meaning. He knows Antigone well, has copied it before. What matters now is accuracy, precision, the physical act of transferring symbols from old papyrus to new. Late in the afternoon, as the light begins to fail, the chief scribe makes his rounds, examining the day's work. He looks over Nestor's shoulder, scans the columns completed. Nestor waits, trying not to show his nervousness. Even after 12 years, he wants approval, wants confirmation that his work meets standards. The chief scribe nods. Good, he says simply. Clean hand. I see you noted the textual problem in column 2. Well done. He moves on to the next scribe. Nestor allows himself a small moment of pride. Then he cleans his pen, covers his ink jar, and carefully rolls up both the original and his partial copy. Tomorrow he will continue. Day by day, scroll by scroll, the library's collection is maintained, refreshed, preserved against the inevitable deterioration of papyrus and ink. He does not think of himself as doing anything extraordinary. He is just a scribe, a craftsman no different from the carpenter who makes furniture or the weaver who makes cloth. But his craft works with words rather than wood or wool, and the products of his craft will endure not just years but centuries, carrying the voices of the dead forward into the future, making it possible for scholars not yet born to read what the greatest minds of Greece have written. As he leaves the library in the evening, his hands still smelling of ink, Nestor thinks that there are worse ways to spend a life. Pirates of the book trade. The book market in Alexandria operates in a warren of streets near the harbour, and if you know what you are looking for, you can find almost anything there. scrolls of poetry and philosophy, histories and scientific treatises, rare works and common texts, genuine articles and outright forgeries. The dealers range from reputable scholars who supplement their income by selling books to outright criminals who will sell you a scroll allegedly written by Plato that was actually composed last week by a hack with a talent for imitating archaic Greek. Marcus has been dealing in books for 20 years, and he prides himself on honesty, or at least relative honesty, in a market where fraud is endemic. He does not sell obvious forgeries, does not claim a scroll is by a famous author when he knows it is not. But he will allow a customer to reach his own conclusions, will carefully avoid confirming or denying attributions when the evidence is ambiguous, will emphasize the antiquity and rarity of a manuscript while glossing over questions of authorship. Today, a potential customer is examining a scroll Marcus acquired from an estate sale in Athens. The scroll purports to be a lost dialogue of Plato, previously unknown, a conversation between Socrates and a mysterious figure named Timaeus about the nature of the cosmos and the creation of the world. The customer is a scholar from the library, or more precisely, a junior assistant to one of the senior scholars sent to evaluate potential acquisitions. The library pays well for rare texts, but they also employ knowledgeable people who are not easily fooled. "May I unroll it?" the scholar asks. "Carefully," Marcus says. The papyrus is quite old. The scholar begins reading, lips moving slightly. Marcus watches his face, trying to gauge his reaction. Is he excited? Skeptical? It is hard to tell. After several minutes, the scholar looks up. "This is interesting," he says carefully. "The style is certainly Platonic. The discussion of cosmology is sophisticated. It comes from a very old private collection in Athens," Marcus says. "The family claims it has been in their possession for generations. Do they have provenance, records of how they acquired it?" Marcus makes a regretful gesture. "Unfortunately, no. The family has fallen on difficult times. They sold everything: books, furniture, even jewelry. They were not concerned with documentation." The scholar nods, returns to reading. After a while, he says, "There are some phrases here that seem anachronistic, references to ideas that I believe came after Plato's time." Marcus feels a sinking in his stomach, but maintains his composure. Perhaps Plato was ahead of his time? Perhaps these ideas originated earlier than scholars believed. Perhaps, the scholar says, but his tone suggests he does not believe it. He continues reading, occasionally making notes on a wax tablet he has brought with him. Finally, he rolls up the scroll and hands it back to Marcus. "I will need to consult with my superiors at the library. This text is certainly interesting, and if genuine, would be quite valuable. But there are questions about authenticity that require further investigation." "Of course," Marcus says smoothly. "I would not want the library to purchase anything of dubious provenance. Perhaps you would be interested in some other items while you consider. I have a beautiful copy of Homer's Odyssey. Only 30 years old, beautifully written, very clear hand." The scholar glances at the Homer, but shakes his head. "The library has many copies of Homer. What we need are rare texts, works that exist in few copies or none." "I understand. But you must also understand, such texts are correspondingly difficult to authenticate. When a work has been widely copied and studied, when dozens of manuscripts exist for comparison, authenticity is easy to establish. But a unique manuscript, a text that survives in only one copy, how does one prove it genuine? The very rarity that makes it valuable also makes it suspect." The scholar smiles slightly. "Indeed, which is why the library employs people like me. Thank you for your time. I will return if my superiors wish to pursue the matter." After he leaves, Marcus sits for a while, thinking he had paid a significant sum for the Timaeus scroll, believing it might be genuine or at least good enough to pass. Now it seems likely the library will reject it. He could try to sell it elsewhere, perhaps to a wealthy collector who cares more about owning rare books than about their authenticity. Or he could be honest with potential buyers, acknowledge the questions about provenance, sell it as a curiosity rather than a genuine Plato dialogue. The book trade has always been like this, a grey area between scholarship and commerce, where value depends on attribution, and attribution is often uncertain. In an age before printing, when every copy is handmade and texts evolve as they are copied, when famous names attract far higher prices than unknown authors, the temptation to forge is enormous. Some forgeries are crude, obvious to any knowledgeable reader. Others are sophisticated, created by scholars who understand the style and language of earlier periods, who can produce texts that pass superficial examination. And some texts occupy a middle ground, legitimately ancient, but of uncertain authorship, with traditions of attribution that may or may not be reliable. The library tries to sort through this confusion, employs scholars to evaluate texts, compares manuscripts to establish accurate versions. But even the library's resources are not infinite. They cannot examine every book for sale. They cannot check every attribution. They must rely on dealers like Marcus, trusting but verifying, paying good prices for genuine rarities while trying to avoid obvious frauds. And Marcus, for his part, tries to maintain a reputation for honesty within the limits of a market where certainty is rare. He will not sell an obvious forgery. He will not claim knowledge he does not have. But he will let ambiguity work in his favour, will allow the romance of discovery to influence potential buyers, will sell dreams along with papyrus and ink. The book trade will continue, regardless of questions about authenticity. Knowledge is valuable. Rare knowledge is more valuable. And in Alexandria, where the greatest library in the world is constantly seeking to expand its collection, where scholars from across the Mediterranean come seeking texts for their research, where wealthy collectors want libraries to display their sophistication, the market for books is booming. Marcus returns to his work, cataloguing new acquisitions, planning his next buying trip. Somewhere out there are scrolls waiting to be discovered, genuine rarities that have survived in forgotten collections. His job is to find them, authenticate them as best he can, and bring them to market. It is not a simple job, and it is not always an honest one, but it is necessary. Without dealers willing to search for rare texts, without a market that rewards discovery, many works would remain hidden, would deteriorate unknown and unread, would be lost forever. And the loss of knowledge, Marcus thinks, would be the greatest tragedy of all. Gardens of debate. In the covered walkways surrounding the library gardens, a debate has been going on for 3 days. It began as a casual conversation over wine, escalated into a serious disagreement, and has now attracted an audience of scholars and students who gather each afternoon to hear the arguments. The question at issue seems abstract, almost trivial to outsiders. Is virtue knowledge, as Socrates claimed, or is it a matter of habit and character, as Aristotle argued? Can a person be taught to be virtuous through instruction, or must virtue be cultivated through practice and experience? But to the participants, the question matters deeply. It touches on education, on ethics, on the nature of human psychology. If virtue is knowledge, then philosophers can teach it, can make people better through argument and instruction. If virtue is habit, then education is less important than upbringing, less about ideas than about practice. The two main disputants are established scholars, both with students and followers. Theophrastus, the elder, argues for the Aristotelian position. His opponent, whose name is Nicomachus, defends a modified Socratic view. They are both brilliant, both well-read, both capable of marshalling impressive arguments and examples. The afternoon sun slants through the columns, creating patterns of light and shadow on the stone floor. 20 or 30 people sit or stand around the two debaters, listening, occasionally interjecting questions or comments. The atmosphere is serious but not hostile. These men are colleagues, not enemies. They disagree profoundly, but the disagreement is intellectual, not personal. Theophrastus is speaking. Consider the case of courage, he says. Does a man become courageous by learning facts about courage, by reading philosophical treatises on the subject? Clearly not. A man becomes courageous by facing danger repeatedly, by training himself to control his fear, by developing habits of behavior that persist even when he is afraid. This is why soldiers drill endlessly, why athletes train their bodies through repetition. They are building virtue through habit, not through knowledge. Nicomachus responds. But what guides the habit? How does one know which habits to cultivate? Surely one must first understand what courage is, must distinguish true courage from mere rashness or foolhardiness. And this understanding is knowledge, is something that can be taught. Without the knowledge, the habit might lead one astray, might produce stubbornness rather than courage, rigidity rather than virtue. Then you admit virtue requires more than knowledge. Theophrastus counters. It requires the knowledge plus the habit, in which case Socrates was wrong. Virtue is not simply knowledge, it is knowledge applied through practiced behavior. I admit no such thing, Nicomachus says with a slight smile. I say that true knowledge includes understanding of how to apply it. Knowledge of courage is not just abstract understanding, but practical wisdom about how to act courageously. Aristotle distinguished between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom, phronesis. But this distinction may be unnecessary. Genuine knowledge of virtue is inherently practical. The argument continues, spiraling through examples and counterexamples, definitions and distinctions, appeals to earlier philosophers and criticisms of their views. The audience listens, some taking notes, some nodding at particularly good points, some frowning at arguments they find weak. A younger scholar raises his hand, tentatively. Theophrastus pauses and nods to him. Forgive me, the young man says, but it seems to me that you are both partly correct. Surely some people are naturally inclined to virtue, are born with good character. Others must work harder to achieve it. Perhaps for the naturally virtuous, knowledge is enough. For others, habit is required. There is no single path. Theophrastus considers this an interesting point. Are you suggesting virtue is partly innate, partly developed? Perhaps. Or perhaps what is innate is the capacity to develop virtue, and different people develop it through different means. Nicomachus shakes his head. This threatens to make the question empirical rather than philosophical. We would need to examine individual cases, which is hardly possible. Philosophy deals with universals, with what is true of human nature generally, not with individual variations. But perhaps, another scholar interjects, individual variations are more significant than we acknowledge. Perhaps there is no universal human nature, or at least it is more various than we assume. This sparks a new branch of the debate. Soon they are arguing about universals and particulars, about whether philosophical knowledge can be certain or is always probabilistic, about the limits of reason and the role of empirical observation. The sun sinks lower, servants bring wine and water, dried figs, bread. The debaters pause to drink and eat. But the conversation continues, less formal now, breaking into smaller groups as different points are discussed. This is what the library has created, a community where such debates can happen, where serious thinkers can devote themselves to questions that have no immediate practical application, where ideas are valued for their own sake. In most cities, philosophers must make a living teaching, must please wealthy patrons, must involve themselves in politics or law or medicine. Here, they can focus purely on thought, can pursue arguments wherever they lead, can spend days or weeks on a single question without worrying about neglecting paying students. Not every conversation is this elevated, of course. Sometimes the scholars gossip about each other, criticize each other's work in less than philosophical terms. argue about library politics, or competition for the king's favour. They are human, subject to pride and jealousy and pettiness. But at their best, in moments like this afternoon's debate, they achieve something rare and precious. They create a space where mind speaks to mind, where the pursuit of truth, however elusive, is the shared goal, where disagreement sharpens rather than destroys understanding. As evening approaches and the debate finally winds down, as scholars drift away to dinner or to their quarters, there is a sense that something valuable has happened. No one has definitively won the argument. The question remains open. But everyone present has thought more deeply about virtue, about knowledge, about human nature. They have challenged their own assumptions, considered perspectives they had not previously entertained, refined their thinking through encounter with opposing views. This, perhaps even more than the preservation of books, is the library's greatest contribution, creating a space where thought can flourish, where intellectual life can be lived fully, where the human capacity for reason can be developed to its highest expression. The gardens and walkways, the dining hall and study rooms, these are not just physical spaces but intellectual spaces, places where the conversation that began with Socrates continues, where questions raised centuries ago still demand answers, where each generation tries to think more clearly than the last. The experiment with the dead. Herophilus stands in the dissection room, looking down at the body on the stone table, and thinks about how strange it is that understanding life requires studying death. The body is that of a criminal, executed yesterday, made available to the library's physicians through an arrangement with the city authorities. In most Greek cities, cutting open human bodies is forbidden, considered impious, or at least disrespectful to the dead. But Alexandria is different. The Ptolemies, wanting their library and Mouseion to advance all forms of knowledge, have granted permission for anatomical research. If such research disturbs Greek sensibilities, well, Alexandria has always been willing to challenge Greek conventions. Herophilus is not alone. Several students attend him, though one has already left the room looking pale. Anatomical work is not for everyone. The smells, the visceral reality of opening a human body, the confrontation with mortality, all of this can be overwhelming, even for those with strong stomachs and genuine interest. He makes the first incision carefully, the skin parts, revealing layers of muscle and fat beneath. He works slowly, explaining as he goes, pointing out structures, asking students to observe carefully. This is not butchery but science. Every cut has a purpose. Every observation must be noted. Here, he says, you can see the external oblique muscle. Notice its direction, how the fibers run. Now I will cut through it to reveal what lies beneath. He has performed perhaps 20 dissections, and each one reveals new details, corrects previous misconceptions, adds to his understanding of human anatomy. Before these dissections, physicians relied on animal anatomy, extrapolating from pigs or dogs to humans. But humans are not pigs, and the differences matter. To understand how the human body works, you must examine human bodies. He exposes the abdominal cavity, the intestines carefully arranged, the organs glistening. The students crowd closer, trying to see. Herophilus identifies each organ, explains its presumed function. Some of this is known from previous work. Some is speculation. The relationship between structure and function is not always obvious. But today he is not focused on the abdomen. His interest lies in the nervous system, a term he himself has coined to describe the network of structures he has discovered that seem to carry sensation and motion throughout the body. He moves to the head, makes incisions to expose the skull, then carefully cuts through the bone. This is delicate work. One wrong cut, and the structures beneath might be damaged. He works with intense concentration, aware that the students are watching, aware that what he discovers today might change how physicians understand the body. The brain lies exposed, grey and wrinkled, unprepossessing in appearance. but Herophilus believes it is the seat of thought, the organ that makes us human. Most people, following Aristotle, believe the heart is the center of thought and feeling, that the brain is merely a cooling organ. But Herophilus's dissections have convinced him otherwise. He traces the nerves extending from the brain down through the spinal column. He has identified two types of nerves, some that carry sensation from the body to the brain, others that carry commands from the brain to the muscles. This distinction between sensory and motor function is his own discovery, not mentioned in any earlier text. "Observe," he says, pointing with a probe. "These nerves connect to the muscles. When we wish to move our hand, the impulse travels from the brain down through these nerves to the muscles of the arm and hand. Without these nerves, the muscles cannot receive commands. The connection is broken." One of the students asks, "How do we know the brain sends commands? Perhaps the muscles act on their own?" "Cut the nerve," Herophilus says, "and the muscle becomes paralyzed. The connection is necessary. This we can prove through experiment and observation." Another student asks, "And the soul? Where does it reside?" Herophilus hesitates. This is dangerous territory. Religious authorities, both Greek and Egyptian, have views about the soul, its nature, and location. To speak too specifically might give offense. "The soul," he says carefully, "is a philosophical question, not a medical one. I speak only of physical structures and their functions. Whether there is something beyond the physical, something that survives death, this is not something dissection can reveal." He continues his work, exposing more of the nervous system, tracing connections, making notes that will later be written up in his treatise on anatomy. The students watch, fascinated and repulsed. This is knowledge purchased at a cost, understanding gained through confrontation with death, insight that requires looking unflinchingly at what humans prefer to keep hidden. The dissection continues for hours. By the end, Herophilus is exhausted, and the body on the table is no longer recognizable as human, reduced to parts and systems, a map of flesh and bone and organ. The students leave, and servants come to remove the remains for burial. Herophilus washes his hands and arms thoroughly, though the smell of death will linger. He thinks about the price of knowledge. The criminal on his table had committed some crime, had been judged and executed. Now his death serves a further purpose, contributes to understanding that might help save lives in the future. Is this redemption of a sort, or merely pragmatic use of available resources? Herophilus does not know. He is a physician, not a philosopher. His job is to understand how the body works, to develop better treatments, to distinguish superstition from knowledge. Whether the dead criminals whose bodies he studies appreciate this higher purpose is not something he can determine, but he knows this. Before Alexandria, before the Library and the Mausian, before the Ptolemy's willingness to challenge conventional pieties, this work would have been impossible. The knowledge he is gaining would have remained undiscovered. Human anatomy would have been guessed at from animal dissections, fundamental structures would have been misunderstood, and physicians would have continued treating patients based on theory rather than observation. Progress in knowledge often requires challenging taboos, pushing against conventional boundaries, doing what others find disturbing or offensive. Alexandria provides space for such work. Whether this space will continue to exist, whether future rulers will maintain the same freedom of inquiry, Herophilus cannot say. But for now, while he still can, he will continue his dissections, will continue mapping the human body, will continue building a foundation of knowledge that future physicians can build upon. The dead cannot object. The living will benefit. And somewhere between these two facts lies the justification for his work. When the king expelled the scholars, the trouble began in 145 BC, though the seeds had been planted years earlier in the poisonous politics of the Ptolemaic court. Ptolemy VIII had not been the designated heir. His elder brother, Ptolemy VI, had ruled Egypt. But when he died, a succession crisis erupted. The eighth, known as Physcon, the potbelly, for his enormous girth, seized power in a coup. He married his brother's widow, Cleopatra II, then later added her daughter, Cleopatra III, as a second wife. Mother and daughter, both named Cleopatra, both married to the same man. The Ptolemaic dynasty had grown strange in its isolation and inbreeding. Physcon was intelligent, but vindictive. He suspected, perhaps rightly, that Alexandria's intellectual elite had supported his brother and viewed him as a usurper. The scholars of the Mausion, comfortable in their palace quarters, protected by tradition and royal patronage, thought themselves above politics. They were about to learn otherwise. The purge came suddenly. Royal guards appeared at the Mausion, carrying a decree. All foreign scholars were to leave Egypt immediately. Only native-born Egyptians could remain. The king's generosity, which had supported scholarship for over a century, was withdrawn. The scholars had until the end of the month to settle their affairs and depart. Panic spread through the scholarly community. These men had made Alexandria their home, some for years, some for decades. They had students and projects, libraries they had built through years of collection, research in progress. And now they were being expelled, cast out with minimal notice, their work interrupted, their lives disrupted. Some tried to protest, to petition the king, to argue that scholarship should be above political considerations. These appeals were ignored, or worse, met with threats. Physcon was not interested in debate. He wanted these intellectuals gone, wanted to remove what he saw as a potential source of opposition. The scholars fled. Eratosthenes, who had measured the earth, was long dead by this time, but many brilliant minds were forced to leave. They scattered across the Mediterranean world, to Rhodes and Athens, to Pergamum and Antioch, carrying their knowledge with them. And here is the bitter irony. The expulsion of scholars from Alexandria enriched every other city that received them. Athens, which had lost its position as the intellectual centre of the Greek world, suddenly gained an influx of brilliant exiles. Pergamum, which had been building its own library, in conscious competition with Alexandria, welcomed Alexandrian scholars who brought expertise in organising and managing collections. Rhodes, Antioch, even Rome benefited from Alexandria's loss. The Library of Alexandria did not close. It continued to function, but something essential had been damaged. The institution's independence, its freedom from political interference, had been revealed as illusory. Royal patronage that could be given could also be withdrawn. A king who felt threatened could, on a whim, destroy what his ancestors had built. Some scholars returned after Physcon's death, but trust had been broken. The sense that Alexandria was a permanent, stable centre of learning, immune to the political storms that wrecked other institutions, was shattered. Scholars now knew they served at royal pleasure, that their position was contingent and revocable, and there were other consequences. The continuity of research was broken. Projects underway were abandoned. Students lost their teachers mid-education. The library's catalogue, which Callimachus had begun and which required constant maintenance and updating, fell behind. New acquisitions were poorly integrated into the collection. The standards of scholarship, maintained for generations through mentorship and tradition, began to slip. The expulsion of 145 BC marked a turning point. Before this, the library's trajectory had been generally upward. Growing collections, increasing prestige, continuous production of significant scholarship. After this, the trajectory became uncertain. There were still moments of brilliance, still important work done, but the golden age was ending. The institution that had seemed eternal was revealed as vulnerable, dependent on political will and royal funding, subject to the whims of rulers who might or might not value learning. The scholars who returned did so warily, knowing they served a dynasty grown paranoid and unstable. The sense of freedom that had characterized earlier scholarship, the willingness to pursue knowledge wherever it led without fear of political consequences, was compromised. Some questions began to seem too dangerous to ask, some debates too risky to have in public. The library would survive for centuries more, but it would never fully recover the confidence and vitality of its first 2 centuries. The cracks in the foundation, once opened, would only grow wider as time passed and political stability continued to deteriorate. The dimming of the light. After Physcon's expulsion of scholars, the library continued, but everyone could feel the change. It was not just the absence of specific individuals, though their loss was keenly felt. It was a shift in atmosphere, in possibility, in the sense of what the institution represented. Money became tighter. The later Ptolemies faced constant financial pressures. Egypt was still rich, but the dynasty was weaker, beset by internal conflicts and external threats. Supporting scholarship, which produced no immediate economic or military benefits, seemed less essential than it had to the confident, wealthy rulers of the 3rd century BC. Book acquisition slowed. The aggressive purchasing that had characterized the library's early decades became sporadic. Ships entering the harbour were still searched for scrolls, but perhaps less systematically. The dealers who had once competed to sell rare manuscripts to Alexandria found fewer buyers, lower prices. Some moved to other cities, where new patrons were building collections. The library's buildings required maintenance. Papyrus deteriorated. Wooden shelving needed replacement. Roofs leaked. These were not dramatic problems, but neglect accumulated. Scrolls that should have been recopied before they became illegible were not. Sections of the collection became difficult to access as shelving weakened. The catalogue, which Callimachus had started and which had been maintained for decades, became increasingly outdated as new acquisitions were imperfectly integrated. Fewer scholars came. The stipends that once attracted the brightest minds from across the Mediterranean were reduced or delayed, or sometimes not paid at all. Why come to Alexandria when Rhodes or Pergamum offered similar resources with more reliable support? Why attach yourself to a dynasty obviously in decline when other options existed? The dining hall, which had once been full of conversation and debate, grew quieter. There were empty seats at meals. The cross-pollination of ideas that had occurred when specialists from every field gathered daily became less frequent as the community shrank. The energy, the sense of collective enterprise, dissipated, and the scholarship itself changed. It became more conservative, more focused on preserving what had already been achieved, rather than pushing forward into new territory. Commentaries were written on earlier works, rather than new works being produced. The goal became transmission, rather than innovation. This was not entirely negative. The commentaries were valuable, preserving understanding that might otherwise have been lost. The careful maintenance of texts, even with reduced resources, meant that many works survived that might not have. But something of the library's original spirit was lost. The confidence that Alexandria was not just preserving the past, but creating the future. The scholars who remained grew older, trained fewer students, produced less work. The younger generation, seeing limited opportunities, pursued careers elsewhere. The average age in the Mausion crept upward. The debates grew less vigorous. Old quarrels were rehashed rather than new questions being raised. And there was a growing sense, though no one wanted to say it openly, that the library's best days were behind it, that what was being lost, slowly and gradually, would never be recovered, that the institution was in decline, was fading, was dying by inches. Rome was rising. That was the context that everyone understood, but few discussed openly. Egypt had once been a major power, the wealthiest kingdom in the eastern Mediterranean. Now it was increasingly a client state, dependent on Roman support, vulnerable to Roman pressure. The Ptolemies still ruled, but they ruled at Rome's sufferance. And Rome, at this point in its history, did not particularly value Greek scholarship. Roman culture was practical, military, legal, philosophy, and pure mathematics seemed irrelevant to Roman priorities. The great Roman patrons wanted poets who would praise them, historians who would record their deeds, orators who could serve in law courts. They did not want geometers calculating the size of the Earth, or astronomers proposing heliocentric models of the solar system. This shift in cultural values affected the library. Scholarship that could not demonstrate practical utility seemed less worthy of support. The pure research that had flourished under the early Ptolemies, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, was harder to justify in an age of shrinking budgets and competing priorities. The light that had burned so brightly for 2 centuries was dimming, not extinguished, not yet, but dimming perceptibly, year by year, as resources dwindled and scholars aged and the political situation grew more precarious. Those who remembered the library in its glory days looked around and mourned. Those who had only known it in decline accepted the diminished state as normal and did their best to maintain what remained. And then, in 48 BC, something happened that would dramatically accelerate the decline, something that would later be remembered, perhaps wrongly, but understandably, as the moment the library died. Caesar came to Alexandria, and the harbour burned. Rome's long shadow. To understand what happened in 48 BC, you need to understand how completely the balance of power in the Mediterranean had shifted. When the Library of Alexandria was founded in the early 3rd century BC, Egypt under the Ptolemies was one of the great powers. Greece was a collection of city-states and smaller kingdoms. Rome was a minor city in Italy, barely known outside the Western Mediterranean. Within 2 centuries, everything had changed. Rome had conquered Italy, defeated Carthage in 3 devastating wars, expanded east into Greece and Asia Minor. By the 1st century BC, Rome effectively controlled the entire Mediterranean basin. The Ptolemaic dynasty survived, but only by accommodating Roman power, by providing grain to feed Rome's growing population, by carefully avoiding any action that might provoke Roman intervention. The later Ptolemies were not independent rulers but clients, their position dependent on Roman approval. This clientage was formalized through personal relationships between Ptolemaic rulers and powerful Romans. The Ptolemies paid enormous bribes to secure Roman support, hosted Roman dignitaries in Alexandria, sent their children to Rome to be educated and to serve as hostages for good behavior. Egypt was nominally independent, but actually subordinate. The Romans, for their part, found this arrangement convenient. Egypt was wealthy, provided essential grain exports, and was easier to control through a client king than through direct rule. As long as the Ptolemies remained cooperative and the grain shipments continued, Rome was content to let the dynasty persist. But Roman politics was chaotic in the 1st century BC. The Republic was collapsing under the weight of its own success. Generals commanded armies more loyal to them personally than to the state. Ambitious men fought civil wars for supremacy, and Egypt, wealthy and strategic, became a prize these Roman warlords coveted. Julius Caesar and Pompey Magnus were rivals for control of Rome. In 48 BC, after years of political maneuvering and eventual civil war, their conflict reached a decisive point. Pompey's forces were defeated at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece. Pompey fled, seeking refuge somewhere he could rebuild his strength. He chose Egypt, believing the Ptolemies would support him out of gratitude for past assistance. He was wrong. The current Ptolemaic rulers, Ptolemy XIII and his sister wife Cleopatra VII, were themselves in conflict. Ptolemy's advisors, calculating that Caesar would win the broader civil war, decided to curry favour with Caesar by eliminating his rival. When Pompey arrived in Alexandria seeking sanctuary, Ptolemy's men killed him, cut off his head, and preserved it to present to Caesar as a gift. This murder of Pompey, intended to please Caesar, actually disgusted him. Caesar arrived in Alexandria shortly after, ostensibly pursuing Pompey, but actually interested in securing Egypt's wealth and resources for his own purposes. He was presented with Pompey's head, and according to sources, wept. Whether from genuine emotion or political theatre, it is hard to say. Caesar established himself in the royal palace complex, effectively occupying Alexandria with his small force of Roman soldiers. He claimed to be there to settle the dispute between Ptolemy and Cleopatra, to restore order, to collect debts Egypt owed Rome. In reality, he was asserting Roman control over Egypt, making clear that the Ptolemies ruled only with Roman permission. The Alexandrians resented this. Their city was being occupied by a foreign army. Their rulers were being dictated to by a Roman general. Tensions grew. Alexandrians, Ptolemy's supporters, hoping to drive Caesar out, began organizing resistance. And Caesar, recognizing the danger, prepared to defend himself. What happened next is where the accounts become confused, where history shades into myth, where we must be careful to separate what actually occurred from what later generations believed occurred. But what is certain is that fire broke out in Alexandria's harbour. Ships burned, buildings near the waterfront caught fire, and in the chaos and destruction, books were lost. How many books? Which books? From which library? All of this is disputed, but something was destroyed that night, and the symbolic weight of that destruction would grow heavier with time. The night the harbour burned. It is 48 BC, winter, and Alexandria is a city on the edge of violence. Caesar occupies the royal palace with perhaps 4,000 soldiers. The Alexandrians, proud of their city's status and resentful of Roman occupation, mass in the streets. Ptolemy XIII's advisors are organizing armed resistance. Cleopatra, who has become Caesar's ally and perhaps lover, is hated by the Ptolemaic court as a traitor who sides with Rome against Egypt. Caesar recognizes his position is precarious. He controls only the palace complex and the harbour district. The rest of Alexandria is hostile territory. He is outnumbered, cut off from reinforcements, dependent on supplies that must come by sea. If the Alexandrians can control the harbour, they can starve him out or trap him until help arrives from elsewhere. The Egyptian fleet is in the harbour, a significant force of warships that could be used against Caesar's ships. Caesar needs to neutralize this threat. His solution is drastic and desperate. He sets fire to the Egyptian fleet. The fire spreads. This is the nature of fire in ancient cities, where buildings are timber and mud brick, where winds from the sea fan flames, where firefighting capabilities are limited. What begins as a deliberate military action becomes an uncontrolled conflagration. Ships burn, warehouses near the harbour catch fire, buildings collapse, people flee, carrying what they can, leaving everything else to the flames. Plutarch, writing more than a century later, says the fire spread from the ships to the buildings along the waterfront and reached the Great Library. Seneca, writing around the same time, claims that 40,000 scrolls were destroyed. Other sources offer different numbers or different details, but the core event is attested by multiple ancient authors. Fire in Alexandria's harbour, destruction of books, connection to Caesar's military operations. What actually burned? This is where certainty dissolves into scholarly debate. The main Library of Alexandria was part of the royal palace complex, away from the immediate harbour area. It is unlikely the fire reached it directly, but there were warehouses near the harbour where books were stored, either for export or as overflow from the main collection. Some scholars believe these warehouse books were what burned, a significant loss, but not the destruction of the library itself. Others suggest that ships in the harbour were being loaded with books, perhaps texts being sent to Rome, or duplicates being shipped to other cities, and these shipborne collections were destroyed when Caesar burned the fleet. This would explain how books were lost in a harbour fire without the main library building burning. The Serapeum, a daughter library in a temple complex elsewhere in the city, was definitely not affected by the harbour fire. It continued to function for centuries after, which is how we know the fire did not destroy all of Alexandria's book collections. What is certain is that some books were lost, enough that ancient writers remembered the event, enough that it entered the historical record. What is uncertain is the scale of the loss. Was it 40,000 scrolls, as Seneca claimed? Or was that number inflated, exaggerated in retelling, turned into myth? Were the lost books irreplaceable, unique texts, or common works that existed in multiple copies? Did the fire actually reach any library building, or did it only destroy books in transit? We cannot know for certain. The sources are limited and sometimes contradictory. Later writers conflated different fires in Alexandria's history, attributed destruction that happened at other times to this fire, turned a genuine but limited loss into a legendary catastrophe. What matters for our purposes is not the exact number of scrolls lost, but what the fire represented. The vulnerability of the library to political violence, the way scholarship could become collateral damage in power struggles between rulers, the fragility of knowledge preserved in a single physical location. Caesar won his conflict with Ptolemy. Ptolemy drowned in the Nile while fleeing Caesar's forces. Cleopatra became sole ruler of Egypt, though effectively Caesar's client. Caesar eventually left Alexandria, taking Egyptian wealth to fund his campaigns, leaving Cleopatra on the throne, and Egypt more firmly under Roman control than ever. And the library, damaged but not destroyed, continued. Books that survived were reorganized. The collection was rebuilt, though never to its former size. Mark Antony, Cleopatra's later Roman ally and lover, would reportedly give her 200,000 scrolls from the library at Pergamum, attempting to compensate for what had been lost. Whether this actually happened or is another legend is debated, but the story suggests that contemporaries recognized the fire's damage and tried to repair it. But something intangible was lost that night, beyond whatever scrolls burned. The sense that the library was inviolable, that scholarship could remain separate from politics, that knowledge was somehow protected by its own importance, all of this was shattered. If Caesar could set fire to the harbour and destroy books in the process, if military necessity could override the preservation of knowledge, then the library's survival depended not on its value to civilization, but on political stability. And political stability was precisely what the Mediterranean world lacked in the 1st century BC. The fire in Alexandria's harbour was just one incident in a century of civil wars, assassinations, invasions, and chaos. The library would survive this particular crisis, but it would not survive forever. The forces that brought Caesar to Alexandria, that set the harbour burning, that subordinated Egypt to Rome, these forces would eventually extinguish the library entirely. Smoke and ashes, memory and myth. In the aftermath of the fire, as smoke drifts over the harbour and workers begin to assess the damage, there is a moment when loss becomes palpable, when the abstract idea of destroyed knowledge takes on concrete weight. A librarian walks through a warehouse near the docks. The roof has collapsed. Charred beams lie across the floor. The smell of burned papyrus hangs in the air, acrid and distinctive. Among the ashes and debris, he finds fragments of scrolls, edges that survived, pieces that escaped complete destruction. He picks them up carefully, trying to identify what they were. Here is part of a historical work, a few lines about the Persian Wars. Here is a fragment of poetry, the words incomplete, the meter broken by fire. Here is what might be medical text or perhaps philosophical dialogue, the context gone, the meaning lost. Most of what burned is unidentifiable. Papyrus burns easily, and what fire leaves behind is ash, formless and undifferentiated. The librarian cannot tell, looking at the ash around him, whether it was Homer or Herodotus, whether it was great works or minor texts. The fire made no distinction. Everything burned equally. He returns to the main library building, which survived undamaged. The collection there is intact. The scholar's work can continue. But everyone is shaken. The fire came close. If the wind had been different, if Caesar had set fires elsewhere in the city, if the chaos had spread further, the entire library might have burned. They begin taking precautions. Some works are copied with new urgency, duplicates made and stored in different locations. The most valuable texts are catalogued again, their contents recorded in case the scrolls themselves are lost. There is talk of building another daughter library in a different part of the city, distributing the collection to reduce the risk of total destruction. But there is also resignation. In an age of civil wars and political instability, how can you truly protect knowledge? The library depends on royal support, on political will, on circumstances beyond scholars' control. A library cannot defend itself. It cannot stop armies or prevent fires. It can only hope that whoever holds power will choose to preserve rather than destroy. Over time, the memory of what was lost in Caesar's fire grows larger than the actual loss. Stories circulate about specific texts that disappeared, though often these stories are inventions or confusions with other losses. The fire becomes a symbol, a moment when the fragility of human knowledge was revealed, when we learned that centuries of careful preservation could be undone in a night. And there is a lesson here, bitter but important. Centralization creates vulnerability. By gathering all knowledge in one place, the library made that knowledge accessible and organized, but also made it vulnerable to a single catastrophe. If books had remained scattered across the Mediterranean world in hundreds of private libraries, no single fire could have threatened them all. But then no single scholar could have accessed them all, could have done the comprehensive work that Alexandrian scholarship required. This is the paradox. To make knowledge maximally useful, you must gather it, organize it, make it accessible. But in gathering it, you make it vulnerable. The very concentration that enables scholarship also enables loss. The librarians understand this now, in the fire's aftermath, in a way they did not before. They continue their work, continue preserving and organizing and studying, but they do so with a new awareness, a recognition that their work is more fragile than they had believed, that the books they protect could be destroyed despite their best efforts, that nothing is permanent, not even the greatest library in the world. The smoke clears, the damage is repaired, life in Alexandria continues, but something has changed. Some confidence has been lost, some innocence about the library's invulnerability has been destroyed as surely as the books in the harbour warehouse. And this is only the beginning. The fire of 48 BC was not the end of the library's troubles. It was just the first major loss in a long, slow process of decline and destruction that would take centuries to complete. A daughter library. Not everything was concentrated in the palace library. The Ptolemies, perhaps recognizing the risks of keeping all books in one place, had established a second library in the Serapeum, the Temple of Serapis, in the Egyptian quarter of Alexandria. The Serapeum was a magnificent complex, a blend of Greek and Egyptian architectural styles dedicated to Serapis, a syncretic god created by the early Ptolemies to unite Greek and Egyptian religious traditions. The temple stood on a hill, visible from much of the city, a symbol of Alexandria's cultural fusion. The library housed in the Serapeum was smaller than the main palace library, but still substantial. Some sources suggest it held 40,000 volumes or more. It served partly as overflow storage for the palace library, partly as a more accessible public library where scholars and students who lacked palace access could read, partly as a research centre, focusing on Egyptian and Near Eastern texts that complemented the palace library's Greek focus. After Caesar's fire damaged the harbour district, the Serapeum library grew in importance. It became a backup, a guarantee that even if the palace library suffered further damage, Alexandria would still have a significant collection. Books were distributed between the two sites. The most valuable or fragile texts remained in the palace library's climate-controlled rooms. More robust copies, works in high demand, duplicates of common texts, these went to the Serapeum. And Mark Antony, during his alliance with Cleopatra in the 30s BC, reportedly gave her the contents of the library at Pergamum to compensate for losses in Caesar's fire. If this actually happened, and the historical evidence is debatable, many of these books likely went to the Serapeum rather than the already crowded palace library. The Serapeum library had a different character than the palace library. It was more open, less exclusive. You did not need royal connections to study there. Students came, merchants with intellectual pretensions, educated Alexandrians of all classes. The reading rooms were busier, noisier, less purely scholarly than the palace library, but it was also more vulnerable to religious tensions. The Serapeum was a pagan temple, and as Christianity grew in Alexandria during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, it became a focal point for conflict between pagans and Christians. The temple represented the old gods, the old ways, the classical learning that Christianity was supplanting. The palace library, if it still existed in any significant form by the late 4th century, was at least politically neutral, a secular institution that could adapt to religious changes. The Serapeum library was embedded in a temple complex dedicated to a pagan god. As Alexandria became increasingly Christian, as pagan temples were closed or converted, the Serapeum's position became precarious. But that would come later. In the religious conflicts of the 4th century, in the 1st century BC, in the aftermath of Caesar's fire, the Serapeum library was simply a valuable complement to the main library, a daughter institution that ensured some distribution of Alexandria's intellectual wealth, a safety mechanism that provided redundancy against future catastrophes. Whether this redundancy would prove sufficient to preserve Alexandria's knowledge through the centuries of decline ahead, whether the Serapeum library would survive what the palace library could not, these questions could not yet be answered. The institutions endured, the books were preserved, scholars continued their work, but the trajectory was clear to anyone paying attention. Rome had come to Alexandria and brought chaos with it. The library had survived, but it had been wounded, and the wound would not heal. The question no one can answer. When did the Library of Alexandria die? It is a simple question that has no simple answer. We know it existed in the 3rd century BC, flourishing and magnificent. We know it does not exist in the 7th century AD, when Arab armies conquer Egypt and find no library. Between these 2 points lies a gap of nearly 1,000 years, and somewhere in that gap, the library disappeared. But how? When? Through what mechanism did the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world cease to exist? The sources are fragmentary, contradictory, sometimes separated by centuries from the events they describe. Later writers, working with limited information and their own agendas, created narratives that may or may not reflect historical reality. And over time, these narratives hardened into myths, stories repeated so often, they became accepted as fact, despite weak or non-existent evidence. The problem is that libraries do not usually die dramatically. Buildings can burn, yes, but a library is more than a building. It is a collection that can be moved, distributed, copied. It is an institution that can adapt, survive, persist through changing circumstances. For a library to truly die, especially one as large and well-established as Alexandria's, requires not a single catastrophe, but a complete collapse of the will and ability to maintain it. Think about what would need to happen. The buildings would need to be destroyed or repurposed. The scrolls would need to be lost, scattered, or deliberately destroyed. The scholars would need to leave or die without training successors. The political and economic support would need to vanish. The cultural values that sustained scholarship would need to change. All of these things would need to happen, and they would likely happen gradually rather than all at once. This makes dating the library's end almost impossible. Do we count its death from the last time it had a full collection, from the last time it had royal support, from the last time significant scholarship occurred there, from the physical destruction of the building? Different answers to these questions yield different dates, ranging from the 1st century BC to the 7th century AD, a span of 700 years. And there is a deeper problem. Much of what we think we know about the library's destruction comes from sources written centuries after the events, from writers who had their own reasons for shaping the narrative in particular ways. Some wanted to blame specific groups, religious or political enemies, for destroying knowledge. Some wanted to create dramatic stories, memorable catastrophes. Some were simply confused, conflating different events in Alexandria's long history. The result is a historical puzzle with missing pieces, with pieces from different puzzles mixed in, with some pieces that were never real, but were created to fill gaps in our understanding. We can examine the pieces we have, can evaluate their reliability, can try to construct a coherent narrative, but we must acknowledge uncertainty, must resist the temptation to turn ambiguous evidence into confident conclusions. So, let us look at the main theories, the stories that have been told about the library's end. Let us examine them critically, noting what we know, what we suspect, and what we cannot know. And let us be honest about the gaps in our knowledge, the places where the historical record falls silent and we are left with speculation. The bishop and the temple. The story goes like this. In 391 AD, the Christian emperor Theodosius issued a decree ordering the closure of pagan temples throughout the Roman Empire. Alexandria's patriarch, a man named Theophilus, took this as license to destroy the Serapeum, the great temple complex that had stood for 600 years as a center of Alexandrian life. Theophilus led a Christian mob to the temple. They tore down the statues of the gods, smashed the altars, destroyed everything pagan. The temple was gutted, desecrated, its stones reused to build Christian churches. And in the process, the library housed in the Serapeum, the daughter library that had complemented the palace library, was destroyed. 40,000 scrolls, works of philosophy and science and poetry, burned or scattered or lost in the chaos of religious violence. This is the story as it has often been told, particularly by those who see the rise of Christianity as hostile to classical learning. But how much of it is true? We know Theodosius did issue decrees against pagan temples. We know Theophilus was Patriarch of Alexandria in the late 4th century. We know the Serapeum was destroyed or converted during this period. These facts are well attested in multiple sources, but did the Serapeum still house a significant library in 391 AD? This is less certain. The palace library had been declining for centuries. After Caesar's fire, after the political chaos of the 1st and 2nd centuries, after the economic decline of the 3rd century, how much remained? Was the Serapeum library still a major institution, or had it dwindled to insignificance? Some sources suggest the Serapeum library had already been largely dispersed or lost by the 4th century. The Roman Emperor Aurelian fought a war in Alexandria in 271 AD, and his forces damaged the area around the Serapeum. This was more than a century before Theophilus. Perhaps the library was destroyed then, or perhaps it survived in reduced form. And even if the library still existed in 391, we have limited evidence about what happened to it. The sources that describe the Serapeum's destruction focus on the temple itself, on the religious conflict, on the toppling of idols. They say little or nothing about books. This silence could mean the books were lost in the destruction, or it could mean there were no significant books there to be lost, or it could simply mean the sources did not consider books important enough to mention. The problem with blaming Theophilus is that it fits too neatly into a narrative of Christian destruction of classical learning. And while there is truth to that narrative, while early Christianity did often view pagan philosophy with suspicion, the reality is more complex. Many Christians preserved classical texts, copied them in monastery scriptoria, valued them as educational tools, even while rejecting their religious content. The survival of much ancient literature through the Middle Ages depended on Christian copyists. Theophilus certainly destroyed the Serapeum as a pagan temple. This is historical fact. Whether he destroyed a library in the process is less certain. It depends on whether the library still existed, how large it was, what priority Theophilus placed on destroying books versus destroying idols. We do not have clear answers to these questions. What we can say is this: by 400 AD, if not earlier, the Serapeum no longer functioned as a library. Whether it was destroyed by Theophilus or had already faded away through neglect and earlier violence, the result was the same. One of Alexandria's two major libraries was gone. But what about the Palace Library, the original Great Library? If it still existed in the 4th century, it might have survived Theophilus's actions. The palace complex was not a pagan temple. It was a secular space that Christians could occupy without religious qualms. If books remained there, they might have been preserved, might have continued to be used by scholars, regardless of religious changes. Or perhaps the palace library was already long gone, by Theophilus's time, had vanished in the chaos of the 3rd century, had been dispersed or destroyed in one of the many conflicts that racked Alexandria. Perhaps Theophilus destroyed only empty buildings, shells of former greatness, libraries that existed in name but no longer in substance. The uncertainty is frustrating but honest. We cannot say definitively what Theophilus destroyed, because we cannot say definitively what remained to be destroyed. The caliph's alleged command. There is another story, more famous, more dramatic, and almost certainly false, but it has been repeated so often, has shaped popular understanding so thoroughly that it must be addressed. In 642 AD, Arab armies, under the command of Amr ibn al-As, conquered Egypt, bringing it under Islamic rule. Amr captured Alexandria, and according to a story first recorded 500 years later by a 13th century Christian writer, sent a question to the Caliph Omar in Medina. What should he do with the books in Alexandria's library? Omar's reply, in this telling, was stark and uncompromising. If these books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary, for the Quran contains all necessary truth. If they disagree with the Quran, they are heretical and should be destroyed. In either case, burn them. So Amr supposedly distributed the books to the bathhouses of Alexandria, using them as fuel to heat the baths. The story claims it took 6 months to burn all the books. So vast was the collection. This story has everything: religious fanaticism, casual destruction of knowledge, a memorable quotation, the exotic detail of books burned to heat bathhouses. It has been repeated by countless historians, has been used to blame Islam for destroying the library, has entered popular consciousness as accepted history. There is only one problem: it almost certainly never happened. The story first appears in the work of Gregory Bar Hebraeus, a Christian writer working in the 13th century, 600 years after the events he describes. No earlier source mentions it. Not Christian sources writing shortly after the Arab conquest. Not Muslim sources describing the conquest of Egypt. Not Jewish sources. Nobody who was actually alive in the 7th century, nobody who might have witnessed these events or heard testimony from witnesses, mentions this story. This is immediately suspicious. The destruction of the greatest library in the world, burned over 6 months to heat bathhouses, would have been a notable event. Contemporary sources would have recorded it. The fact that they do not strongly suggests it never happened. Moreover, the story does not fit what we know about early Islamic attitudes toward learning. The early caliphs valued scholarship, established libraries, commissioned translations of Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic. The Islamic world would become the preserver of much classical learning during the Middle Ages, maintaining texts that Christian Europe had lost. While there were certainly conflicts between Islamic and non-Islamic cultures, the wholesale destruction of a library does not fit the pattern of early Islamic governance. Most modern historians reject the Omar story as a medieval fabrication, possibly created to discredit Islam, possibly arising from confusion with other events, possibly simply a dramatic fiction that someone invented and others repeated. It has no reliable historical foundation, but even if we reject the specific story, we still face a question. Was there still a significant library in Alexandria in 642 AD when the Arabs arrived? If not, if the library had already disappeared centuries earlier, then Omar could not have destroyed it regardless of whether the story is true. And here is where the evidence becomes very thin. We have almost no descriptions of Alexandria's libraries in the 5th and 6th centuries. References to scholars working in Alexandria become rare. The city was in decline, had suffered earthquakes and fires, had been fought over by Romans and Persians. By the time the Arabs arrived, Alexandria was no longer the great city of the Ptolemaic age. It was diminished, provincial, a shadow of its former glory. Most historians believe that if any significant book collection existed in 7th century Alexandria, it was probably not the ancient library but something else, perhaps a Christian library attached to a church or monastery. And if Amr or Omar destroyed such a library, which is possible but unproven, it was not the ancient Library of Alexandria, which had almost certainly vanished long before. The Omar story persists, not because it is well evidenced, but because it is memorable, because it provides a simple answer to a complex question, because people want there to be a specific moment when the library died, a villain to blame, a dramatic ending to the story. But history rarely provides such neat narratives. Death by 1,000 cuts. The most likely explanation for the library's disappearance is the least dramatic. It died gradually, over centuries, through neglect and decline, through the dispersal and deterioration of its collection, through the slow extinction of the institutions and values that had sustained it. This is not a satisfying answer. There is no date we can point to, no event we can commemorate, no person to praise or blame, but it fits the evidence better than any single destruction theory. Consider what we know. The library was in decline after the expulsion of scholars in 145 BC. It was damaged in Caesar's fire in 48 BC. It suffered through the political chaos of the late Republic and early Empire. By the 3rd century AD, Alexandria was experiencing economic hardship, political instability, religious conflict. These are not conditions in which scholarship thrives. The 4th century brought the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity, which did not necessarily mean hostility to classical learning, but did mean a shift in cultural priorities. Pagan temples, including possibly the Serapeum, were closed. Royal patronage for scholarship, never strong in the Roman period, ceased entirely. The Mouseion, if it still existed as an institution, no longer received funding. The 5th and 6th centuries saw Alexandria's further decline. The city was repeatedly damaged by earthquakes. It was caught up in theological disputes that sometimes turned violent. The educational infrastructure that had supported scholarship deteriorated. There were still scholars in Alexandria, still people who valued learning, but the great institution that had been the Library of Alexandria, the comprehensive collection with royal support and a community of scholars, was gone. What remained were scattered collections, private libraries, books in churches and monasteries, fragments of the former glory. Some of these books would be preserved, would eventually make their way to Constantinople or Baghdad, would survive to be copied by medieval scribes. But the library as a unified institution, as the place where all knowledge was gathered and organized and studied, had ceased to exist. The buildings probably survived longer than the collection. Stone and brick can stand empty for centuries. The rooms that once held scrolls might have been used for other purposes, might have housed government offices, or been converted to churches or simply abandoned. Eventually, even the buildings would have been destroyed or repurposed beyond recognition, their stones reused in other construction, their location forgotten, and the books, those that survived the various crises, would have been dispersed. Some sold by their owners when they needed money, some given to churches or monasteries, some carried away by scholars, leaving Alexandria for other cities, some simply neglected, left to deteriorate in storage rooms nobody visited, the papyrus crumbling, the ink fading, the words becoming illegible, and then vanishing entirely. This is how most ancient books were lost, not through dramatic fires or deliberate destruction, but through the simple failure to preserve them, through lack of interest or resources, or political stability, through the slow, inevitable decay of physical materials that nobody bothered to copy before they became unreadable. By 600 AD, if not earlier, there was probably nothing left that could reasonably be called the Library of Alexandria. There were books in Alexandria, certainly, but the great collection, the comprehensive catalogue, the institution that had been the intellectual centre of the world, all of that was gone, had been fading for centuries, had finally disappeared so gradually that nobody could say exactly when it ended. This is the tragedy of the library, not that it burned in a single night, but that it faded across generations, that each successive crisis diminished it, that each century saw fewer books and fewer scholars, until finally there was nothing left but memory and myth. And what makes this especially poignant is that the loss was not inevitable. If different choices had been made, if political stability had been maintained, if cultural values had not shifted, if resources had been allocated differently, the library might have survived. The books could have been copied, the collection could have been preserved, the institution could have adapted to changed circumstances, but these things did not happen, and so the library died, not suddenly but slowly, not dramatically but almost invisibly, until one day people realized it was gone and could not say exactly when they had lost it. Ghosts in the margins. Close your eyes and imagine a library of ghosts. Not the ghosts of people, but the ghosts of books. Titles without texts, names without words, the shadows of knowledge that once existed and now exists only as references in other works. There was a history of the world in 47 books by someone named Ephorus. It covered Greek history, from the legendary return of the Heraclidae to the siege of Perinthus. Later, historians quoted from it, relied on it, cited its authority, but the work itself is gone, scattered in fragments, mostly lost. We know it existed. We know roughly what it contained. We cannot read it. There was a work called the Persica by someone named C. Ctesias, a history of Persia and India, written by a Greek physician who served the Persian court. He saw things no other Greek writer saw, had access to Persian royal records, described distant lands and strange customs. Later writers used his work, sometimes crediting him, sometimes not. A few fragments survive, quotations in other books. The rest is lost. There were plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides that we know about from references and catalogues but cannot read. Of Aeschylus's 90 plays, we have 7. The other 83 exist only as titles, sometimes with brief descriptions, tantalizing hints of plots we will never know. Sophocles wrote 123 plays. We have 7. Euripides wrote 92 plays. We have 19. There were scientific treatises, mathematical works, philosophical dialogues, historical chronicles, epic poems, medical texts, astronomical observations. The Pinax, Callimachus's great catalogue, listed them all. And the catalogue itself is lost, exists only as fragments and references, a ghost catalogue of ghost books. Sometimes we know quite a bit about a lost work. We know the author, the title, the approximate length, even some specific contents because later writers quoted passages. These are the most haunting losses, the books we can almost reconstruct from fragments scattered through surviving literature. We know what we are missing, can glimpse what the work might have offered, feel the absence as a specific shape in our knowledge. Other times, We have only the briefest references, a title mentioned in passing, an author cited once for a single fact. These works are shadows of shadows, hints of books that existed, but about which we know almost nothing. They vanish so completely that we cannot even properly mourn them. And then there are the works we do not know about at all, the books that disappeared so thoroughly that not even their title survived, that were lost before anyone could mention them in a surviving text. These are the unknown unknowns, the invisible gaps in our knowledge. We cannot list them, cannot mourn them individually, can only know abstractly that they existed, that the library held more than we can account for, that what we have lost is greater than what we know we have lost. The tragedy is not just that we lost these works, but that we lost them from the very place that was supposed to preserve them forever. The Library of Alexandria was meant to be humanity's backup, the place where all knowledge would be safe, where texts endangered elsewhere would survive. And for centuries it succeeded. But ultimately it could not protect against its own destruction, could not preserve even itself. In later centuries, when Byzantine and Islamic scholars tried to recover ancient knowledge, they searched for manuscripts, compared texts, translated from one language to another. Sometimes they found what they sought. Often, they found only references to books that no longer existed. The trail would lead back to Alexandria, to citations in the Pinax, or mentions in works known to have been in the library's collection, and then the trail would stop. The book had been in Alexandria once. Now it was nowhere. Modern scholars do the same work, still searching, still hoping. Occasionally a new fragment is discovered, a papyrus unearthed in Egypt, a palimpsest decoded using modern imaging technology. Each discovery is celebrated, treated as a rescue from oblivion, but such discoveries are rare. Most of what was lost will stay lost forever, and so we live with ghosts, with the knowledge that our understanding of the ancient world is incomplete, that we are reading ancient literature through fog, that for every text we have, multiple texts are missing, that our picture of classical civilization is sketched from fragments rather than painted complete. The library was supposed to prevent this. That was its purpose, its reason for existing, and for centuries it did prevent it, did preserve works that might otherwise have vanished, did maintain texts through periods when they might have been lost. But in the end, the library itself became part of what was lost, and its destruction meant the loss, not just of one institution, but of centuries of accumulated human knowledge, insight, and creativity. The palimpsest speaks, but loss is not always permanent. Sometimes, in unexpected ways, the past resurfaces. Knowledge thought lost can be recovered. Words written in antiquity can speak again across the centuries. The story of the Archimedes palimpsest shows this. Offers hope that not everything vanished forever. In the 13th century AD, a monk in Constantinople needed parchment. Parchment was expensive, made from animal skins, carefully prepared. But the monastery had old books, manuscripts nobody read anymore, texts in Greek that few could understand. One such text was a copy of works by Archimedes, the great mathematician of Syracuse, who had lived in the 3rd century BC. The monk took this manuscript, perhaps 800 years old by then, and did what was common practice. He washed the pages, scrubbed away the ancient ink, and reused the parchment to write a prayer book. The words of Archimedes disappeared beneath Christian liturgy. The palimpsest, the twice-written book, joined the monastery's collection and was forgotten. Centuries passed. The Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople. The monastery's library was dispersed. Books were sold, moved, scattered. The prayer book, with its hidden text, passed through unknown hands, ended up in Paris in the 19th century, was noticed by a scholar who realized the faint traces of earlier writing, visible beneath the prayers, might be something significant. Analysis revealed what had been scraped away. Archimedes. Not just any Archimedes, but works known to have existed but previously lost, including the method of mechanical theorems, in which Archimedes described his techniques for mathematical discovery, revealed how he used mechanical thinking to solve geometric problems, showed insights that would not be independently rediscovered for nearly 2,000 years. The palimpsest was recognized as treasure, was kept in private collection, disappeared again during the chaos of the 20th century. Then, in 1998, it resurfaced at auction. An anonymous buyer purchased it for $2 million and made it available to scholars. Modern imaging technology, using X-rays and ultraviolet light, could read texts that earlier scholars could barely see. Word by word, line by line, Archimedes' lost work was recovered. What we learned astonished mathematicians. Archimedes had been even more brilliant than anyone had realized, had approached mathematical concepts of infinity and integration that would not be formally developed until the 17th century, had been thinking thoughts that seemed impossibly advanced for his era. And all of this had been preserved, accidentally, beneath prayers, waiting to be rediscovered. The Archimedes palimpsest demonstrates something important. The past is not as dead as we think. Texts we believe lost may survive in unexpected places, may wait in obscure manuscripts for someone to find them. What seems gone forever may only be hidden, may be recoverable with patience and technology and luck. Could this happen with works from the Library of Alexandria? Possibly. The library's collection was dispersed, not entirely destroyed. Books were sold, stolen, carried away. Some might have ended up in private collections, in monastery libraries, in forgotten storage rooms. Most would have deteriorated and disappeared, but perhaps a few survived, were copied before they vanished, exist somewhere still waiting to be found. Every few years, scholars announce new discoveries. A fragment of Sappho's poetry in ancient papyrus used as mummy wrapping, a new section of an Euripides play found in a medieval manuscript. Lost sections of the Greek anthology recovered from a palimpsest. These discoveries are small, fragments and scraps rather than complete works, but each one is a voice from the past speaking again, knowledge recovered from loss. And each discovery reminds us of how much remains lost, how much we would give to find. If we could recover just one more play by Sophocles, if we could find Aristotle's dialogues, which were famous in antiquity, but survive only as references, if we could read the lost books of Livy's history, the missing poems of Sappho, the vanished works of the pre-Socratic philosophers, if we could recover even a fraction of what the Library of Alexandria contained, our understanding of the ancient world would be transformed. But this is probably fantasy. Most of what was lost is truly gone, disintegrated beyond recovery, vanished so completely that not even traces remain. The papyrus has turned to dust. The words have faded beyond reading. The scrolls are ash, or fragments, or nothing at all. Still, the occasional recovery, the rare discovery, keeps alive a hope that is probably irrational, but too beautiful to abandon. That somewhere, in some forgotten archive, some overlooked manuscript, some unexcavated library buried in desert sands, the lost works of antiquity wait, that we have not lost them forever, that they might yet speak to us, might yet share what they knew, might yet close some of the gaps in our knowledge that the destruction of the library created. It is a small hope, growing smaller as time passes, and the likelihood of major discoveries diminishes. But it persists, this dream of recovery, this belief that loss need not be final, that the past might yet surrender some of its secrets. Searching for the ruins, where was the Library of Alexandria? This should be a simple question. It was a large building complex, well known in antiquity, described by numerous ancient authors. We should be able to point to its location, perhaps excavate its ruins, confirm through archaeology what we know from texts. But we cannot. The location of the library is unknown. Modern Alexandria sits atop ancient Alexandria, a living city built on the ruins of the old. Streets and buildings, shops and houses, the entire infrastructure of a modern metropolis covers whatever remains of Ptolemaic Alexandria. You cannot simply excavate freely when people live there, when every dig would disrupt modern life. Scholars have proposed various locations based on ancient descriptions and the few archaeological finds that have been made. The palace quarter was in the eastern part of the city, near the waterfront. That much is known. But the palace quarter was vast, and the library could have been anywhere within it. Different ancient sources offer slightly different descriptions, emphasizing different landmarks, making it hard to establish exact positions. Some excavation has been possible, particularly when new construction requires archaeological assessment. These digs have found Ptolemaic-era structures, columns and foundations, pieces of statuary, some inscribed stones, but nothing clearly identifiable as the library. No great reading room filled with scroll cabinets, no catalogue inscriptions listing holdings, nothing that says definitively, "Here stood the Library of Alexandria." The sea has complicated matters. Alexandria's coastline has changed over 2 millennia. Parts of the ancient city, including portions of the palace quarter, now lie underwater. Marine archaeologists have explored these submerged ruins, have found extraordinary treasures, including statuary and building foundations. But identifying specific buildings from jumbled underwater ruins is nearly impossible. That column might have been from the library, or from a temple, or from any of a dozen other structures. And there is a deeper problem. We do not know exactly what we are looking for. What did the library look like? Ancient sources describe it in general terms, but provide few architectural specifics. Was it one large building, or multiple buildings? How were the rooms arranged? What distinguished it architecturally from other palace structures? Without clear descriptions, even if archaeologists found the ruins, they might not recognize them. Some scholars argue that the library may have left no distinctive archaeological footprint. It was primarily a collection of scrolls stored in wooden cabinets. The scrolls are long gone, disintegrated. The cabinets are long gone, rotted or burned. What remains would be just ordinary rooms, perhaps with some stone shelving built into walls, but otherwise indistinguishable from any other rooms in the palace complex. In 2002, the Egyptian government opened a new library in Alexandria, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a self-conscious attempt to revive the ancient institution's spirit. It is a magnificent modern building, containing millions of books, serving as a cultural centre and research institution, but it sits nowhere near where the ancient library stood, because nobody knows where that was. It is a spiritual successor, not a physical restoration. The search for the ancient library continues, but expectations are modest. Most archaeologists believe that even if the exact location were found, little of archaeological significance would remain. Too much time has passed. Too many other structures have been built atop the ruins. The organic materials that made up most of the library's contents have long since vanished. At most, we might find foundation stones, some architectural fragments, perhaps inscriptions that would confirm, yes, here was the library. But we would not find scrolls, would not find the catalogue, would not find the knowledge that was lost. And perhaps this is fitting. The Library of Alexandria exists now more as idea than as place, more as symbol than as archaeological site. What matters is not the physical location, not the stones and foundations, but what the library represented. The ambition to gather all human knowledge, the belief that learning deserves support, the hope that wisdom can be preserved across generations. The ruins, if we found them, would just be ruins. The real library, the important library, exists in our collective memory, in our continued efforts to collect and preserve knowledge, in every modern library that follows Alexandrian principles of comprehensive collecting and systematic organization. That library was never in one place. It is everywhere. People work to preserve knowledge, and nowhere specific ruins can be identified. Still, we search. Still, we hope to find something physical, some tangible connection to this legendary institution. Because humans want places they can visit, ruins they can touch, physical evidence that what they remember actually existed. We want to stand where Eratosthenes stood, touch stones that Callimachus might have touched, walk through rooms where Herophilus dissected and Euclid taught. We probably never will. The Library of Alexandria has vanished from the physical world almost as completely as the books it contained. What remains is memory, story, symbol, and perhaps that is enough. The library that lives in memory. But why does it still haunt us? This library lost 2,000 years ago. Why do we mourn it? Write about it? Dream of its recovery? Countless libraries have been destroyed throughout history. Countless books have been lost. Why does this one, specifically, occupy such prominent space in our collective imagination? Perhaps because it symbolizes something fundamental about human vulnerability. We are mortal, our bodies decay, our memories fail, but we thought our knowledge could be preserved, could outlast individual lives, could accumulate across generations. The library represented that dream of permanence, of transcendence through accumulated wisdom. And its destruction reminds us that even knowledge is mortal, that even our greatest intellectual achievements are vulnerable, that nothing we build, not even wisdom itself, is guaranteed to survive. The Library of Alexandria has become shorthand for loss, for the tragedy of destroyed knowledge. When we say something is the Library of Alexandria of our time, we mean something precious and irreplaceable, whose destruction would be catastrophic. When we worry about digital preservation, about how to ensure today's knowledge survives for future generations, we invoke the Library of Alexandria as cautionary tale, but the symbol is double-edged. Yes, the library was lost, and that loss was tragedy, but for 600 years or more, it existed. For centuries, it preserved knowledge, advanced scholarship, made possible intellectual achievements that shaped civilization. Its survival for that long, under changing political circumstances and through numerous crises, was itself remarkable. Most institutions do not last generations, let alone centuries, and what was learned there did not entirely disappear. Euclidean geometry survived, Eratosthenes' calculation of Earth's circumference survived, Herophilus' anatomical discoveries survived, at least in summary. The methods of scholarship pioneered in Alexandria survived, were transmitted to later civilizations, influenced how knowledge is organized and preserved even now. Some of what survived came through direct transmission, books copied before the library was lost, manuscripts that made their way to Constantinople or Baghdad, texts preserved by Byzantine and Islamic scholars. Some survived indirectly, through summaries and references in later works, through knowledge incorporated into new texts, even when the originals vanished. The library's destruction did not erase everything it achieved. It interrupted the transmission of knowledge. Certainly, it created gaps that will never be filled. But it did not completely break the chain, connecting ancient wisdom to modern understanding. We still stand, however uncertainly, on foundations laid in Alexandria, and the dream the library represented never died. Every great library since has been, in some sense, an attempt to recreate what Alexandria achieved: comprehensive collection, systematic organization, support for scholarship, preservation across time. The Library of Pergamum tried to rival Alexandria. Medieval Islamic libraries in Baghdad and Cordoba were consciously modelled on Alexandria. The Vatican Library, the British Library, the Library of Congress, all inherit Alexandrian ambitions. In our own time, we see new expressions of the same dream. The internet has been compared to the Library of Alexandria, an attempt to make all human knowledge accessible to all humanity. Projects to digitize every book ever published, to archive every website, to preserve human knowledge in formats that might survive technological change, all of these echo the Ptolemy's ambition to collect everything, and we face similar challenges. How do you organize infinite information? How do you distinguish valuable knowledge from noise? How do you preserve digital formats that may become obsolete? How do you maintain institutional structures across generations? How do you protect knowledge from deliberate destruction or gradual neglect? These are Alexandrian questions. The same questions the librarians of the Ptolemaic period faced. The scale has changed, the technology has changed, but the fundamental challenge remains. How do we preserve what we know for those who come after us? The Library of Alexandria failed in this mission, ultimately, but it tried, and for centuries, it succeeded. Its failure does not diminish the importance of the attempt, and its loss reminds us that preservation is not automatic, that knowledge requires active protection, that each generation has a responsibility to maintain what it has inherited and pass it forward to the next generation. We remember the Library of Alexandria because we still need what it represented. We still hope to gather all knowledge, still believe that learning matters, still work to preserve wisdom across time. The library is gone, but its mission continues. And as long as people care about knowledge, about learning, about preserving the best of human thought and creativity, the Library of Alexandria will remain alive in memory, an inspiration and a warning, a symbol of human ambition and human fragility. Every library is Alexandria. Walk into any modern library, and you are walking in Alexandria's shadow. The way books are organized, the catalogue systems that help you find them, the belief that a library should collect broadly rather than narrowly, the idea that knowledge should be preserved and made accessible, all of these descend from practices pioneered in Alexandria 23 centuries ago. The Dewey Decimal System and the Library of Congress classification are the distant descendants of Callimachus's Pinaques. When you search a library catalogue, you are using tools that Alexandrian librarians first developed. When libraries collect in multiple languages, translate important works, try to represent diverse human knowledge, they are following Ptolemaic precedent. And the ethos of librarianship, the professional dedication to preservation and access, to maintaining collections and serving researchers, to protecting knowledge even when political pressures might push towards censorship. This too echoes Alexandrian values. Librarians today see themselves as inheritors of a tradition stretching back to Demetrius of Phalerum and the scholars of the Mouseion. Universities are also Alexandria's children. The idea of an institution that supports pure research, that employs scholars to pursue knowledge for its own sake, that brings together specialists from different fields. This model comes from the Mouseion, medieval universities, Renaissance academies, modern research institutes, all adapted and expanded the Alexandrian template, and the dream of universal knowledge, of collecting everything humanity has thought and discovered, remains alive. Projects like Wikipedia, like the Internet Archive, like Google's attempt to digitize every book, like the Human Genome Project or the Large Hadron Collider, all express the same impulse that built the Library of Alexandria, the belief that knowledge is valuable, that comprehensiveness matters, that we should try to understand everything we can about our world and ourselves. These projects face Alexandrian challenges. How do you organize infinite information? How do you ensure accuracy when sources conflict? How do you fund comprehensive collection over generations? How do you protect against loss, whether through technological failure or deliberate destruction? How do you make knowledge accessible without making it vulnerable? And they face a challenge Alexandria ultimately could not overcome. How do you ensure continuity when political circumstances change? The library depended on royal support. When that support wavered, the library declined. Modern knowledge institutions depend on governmental funding, on private philanthropy, on cultural values that prioritize learning. These too can change. What seems secure today may be vulnerable tomorrow. The lesson of Alexandria is not that preservation is impossible, but that it requires constant effort, constant vigilance, constant recommitment. Knowledge does not preserve itself. Books decay. Digital formats become obsolete. Institutions lose funding. Cultural priorities shift. Unless each generation chooses to maintain what it inherited, loss is inevitable. But we have advantages Alexandria lacked. We can distribute knowledge across many institutions, many locations, many formats. Redundancy provides protection. If one library burns, others survive. If one digital archive fails, backups exist elsewhere. We do not have to trust everything to a single place, as the ancient world trusted everything to Alexandria, and we have technologies for preservation that Demetrius and Callimachus could never have imagined. We can copy books infinitely without degradation. We can store information in formats that may last centuries. We can share knowledge instantly across the world. The challenges we face are real, but our tools are powerful. Still, the loss of the Library of Alexandria reminds us that nothing is permanent, that even our best efforts at preservation may ultimately fail, that we should not take the survival of knowledge for granted. Every book, every library, every archive is precious and vulnerable. What we have only because previous generations worked to preserve it. What we leave to future generations depends on the work we do now. In this sense, every librarian is working in Alexandria's tradition. Every archivist, every scholar, every person who contributes to the preservation and transmission of knowledge is continuing the work the Mousillon began. The original library is gone, but its mission persists. And as long as that mission persists, as long as people work to preserve and share knowledge, the Library of Alexandria, in the deepest sense, has not been destroyed. It has been distributed, multiplied, expanded across the world. We are all keepers of Alexandria's flame now. The library is gone, but what it represented survives in every library that follows its example, in every institution dedicated to learning, in every effort to preserve human knowledge and make it accessible. The building may be lost, the scrolls may be ash, but the dream endures, the eternal scroll. Picture a scroll that never ends, that contains everything ever written, everything ever known, everything humanity has discovered and imagined and wondered about. Picture it unrolling forever, column after column of text, image after image, idea after idea, the accumulated knowledge of all generations past and present and future. This scroll exists nowhere physically, but it exists as concept, as aspiration, as the goal toward which all libraries reach. The Library of Alexandria was an attempt to create this scroll, to gather everything, to make comprehensive the scattered knowledge of the world. It failed, as all such attempts must fail, because knowledge is infinite and institutions are finite. But the attempt itself was beautiful, was valuable, was worth making even though ultimate success was impossible. We continue that attempt. Every book added to a library, every article published, every discovery shared, every student taught, adds to the eternal scroll. We write it collectively, across generations, each contribution building on what came before, each insight opening possibilities for future discoveries. The scroll includes not just what we know, but what we have lost and remembered that we lost. The gaps matter, the absences matter, the awareness that we do not know everything, that much has been forgotten, that mysteries remain. All of this is part of the eternal scroll. We write around the gaps, acknowledge the losses, work to prevent future losses even as we accept that loss is inevitable. And the scroll is always changing. New knowledge added, old knowledge reinterpreted, errors corrected, perspectives shifted. What seems certain becomes doubtful. What was forgotten is recovered. The scroll grows and evolves, a living thing rather than a static record. The Library of Alexandria was one physical manifestation of this eternal scroll, one attempt to gather and preserve and organize. It succeeded for centuries. It failed in the end. But its existence, even its failure, contributes to the ongoing project. We learned from Alexandria what is possible and what is vulnerable. We learn the value of systematic organization, the importance of redundancy, the necessity of continued support, the fragility of even the greatest human achievements. And we continue writing the scroll in libraries and universities, in archives and museums, in databases and websites, in books and articles and conversations. The work goes on. Knowledge accumulates, understanding deepens. The scroll unrolls further, revealing new vistas, new questions, new mysteries to explore. Somewhere in this eternal scroll are the lost works of Alexandria, the books we can no longer read, but which we know existed. They are written in invisible ink, present as gaps, as references in later works, as titles without content. We acknowledge them, we mourn them, but we continue writing around them, filling in what we can, accepting that some pages will always remain blank. And somewhere in the scroll that has not yet unrolled, in the future sections we have not yet written, there are discoveries that will transform how we see the world, insights that will solve mysteries we currently cannot solve, knowledge that will seem miraculous to us now. The scroll extends in both directions, into past and future, and we occupy the eternal present where reading and writing happen, where what has been learned is preserved and what will be learned awaits. The Library of Alexandria is part of the eternal scroll. Its story is written there, its achievements and its losses, its scholars and its books, the knowledge it preserved, and the knowledge that perished with it. We read that section of the scroll with sorrow and wonder, with gratitude for what survived and grief for what was lost. And then we continue to the next column, the next page, the next chapter of human knowledge that we ourselves are writing. The scroll never ends, because the human capacity for learning, for questioning, for discovering never ends. As long as people wonder, as long as they seek to understand, as long as they work to preserve and share what they learn, the scroll continues to unroll, column by column, generation by generation, an eternal record of humanity's engagement with knowledge. And in that scroll, forever, Alexandria holds its place, not as tragedy alone, but as achievement, not just as loss, but as inspiration, not the end, but a chapter in an ongoing story that began before the library was built and continues long after its destruction. What the waves remember. Return now to where we began, to Alexandria's harbour, to the Mediterranean lapping against stone quays that have stood for over 2,000 years. The waves have seen everything. They saw Alexander's vision when he stood here in 331 BC, imagining a city that did not yet exist. They saw the library rise, saw scholars arrive from across the known world, saw ships unloaded, their cargoes of grain and wine and books. They watched the harbour fill with commerce and learning, watched Alexandria become the wonder of its age. The waves saw fire in 48 BC, saw Caesar's fleet burn, and the flames spread to buildings along the waterfront. They heard the sounds of battle and destruction, carried away the ashes of whatever burned that night. They saw the city recover, rebuild, continue despite its losses. They saw the centuries of gradual decline, watched as Alexandria diminished, as the palace complex fell into disrepair, as the library faded from prominence and then from existence. They were witness to transformations, political and religious, to the rise of Christianity and the fall of paganism, to the arrival of Islam and the passage of the city from one empire to another. And they are here still, these same waves, these same waters that witnessed everything, that remember in their own way what we have forgotten in ours. They carry no books, preserve no detailed histories, but they hold something, continuity, permanence, the knowledge that what seems eternal passes and what passes leaves traces. Walk along the harbour in modern Alexandria, and you can still feel the history beneath your feet, in the stones worn smooth by time, in the channels and quays that have seen millennia of ships arrive and depart. The library is gone, the scholars are gone, the books are gone. But the sea remains, patient and eternal, witness to all human ambition and all human loss. And perhaps this is comfort, of a kind that however much we lose, however much we forget, the world continues. The waves still arrive in rhythm, unchanged since before humanity existed. The sun still rises over the Mediterranean, as it did when Eratosthenes calculated its distance. The stars still trace their paths across the night sky, as they did when Alexandrian astronomers charted their positions. Knowledge is fragile. Human institutions are temporary. Even our greatest achievements eventually fade. But the world that knowledge describes, the reality we work to understand, that endures. What the library contained was not the universe itself, but our understanding of it. The loss of that understanding is tragedy, but the universe remains, patient, available for future generations to study, to wonder about, to slowly comprehend. The scholars of Alexandria looked at the world with fresh eyes, asked questions nobody had asked before, discovered truths that changed how humanity thought about itself and its place in the cosmos. That spirit of inquiry was not destroyed when the library burned. It lived on in other scholars, other cities, other institutions. It lives on still, in everyone who looks at the world and asks, why, how, what if? The Library of Alexandria was an expression of that spirit, perhaps the greatest expression the ancient world achieved. Its loss diminished us, left gaps in our knowledge that will never be completely filled. But the spirit itself survives, continues, drives us still to ask and search and discover. And so we remember Alexandria, not just with mourning, but with gratitude. Gratitude that it existed at all, that for centuries it preserved and advanced human knowledge. Gratitude for what survived, for the texts and ideas and methods that were transmitted to later generations. Gratitude for the example it set, the standard it established, the dream it embodied of what a library, what a community of learning, what human dedication to knowledge could achieve. The waves remember. They carry that memory forward, moment by moment, into the future. And we, standing on the shore, looking out at waters that have seen so much, can remember too, can honour what was lost and celebrate what survived, can recommit ourselves to the work of preserving and sharing knowledge, of building libraries and institutions, of supporting scholarship and learning. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but its spirit persists wherever people gather to learn, wherever books are preserved, wherever knowledge is valued and protected. Every library is Alexandria. Every scholar continues the work. Every book saved is a small victory against the inevitable losses of time. It's been my honour to present these gentle stories from the ages. May history's gentle embrace guide you to restorative slumber.